The hallway went cemetery quiet. The second, the patch hit the floor. One moment it was on her shoulder, faded, blood-stained, worn through 3 deployments and 100 nights, and 100 nights she didn't talk about. The next, a hospital commander in a pressed uniform was standing over it like it was garbage. His lip curled, his voice carrying the particular contempt of a man who had never once been shot at. "You're an embarrassment to this institution," he said. She looked at the patch on the linoleum. Then she looked at him. And for the first time in 4 years, Nurse Sarah Donovan stopped being quiet. Before we go any further, if you found this channel today, hit that subscribe button right now. Every week I bring you stories that will stop you cold, the kind that stay with you long after the screen goes dark. Hit the like button if this one already has your pulse running, and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. Now let's go back to that hallway. Because what happened next didn't just change Sarah Donovan's life. It changed everything about how that hospital understood the word respect. Sarah Donovan had not planned on making enemies her first month at Hartwell Military Medical Center. That was the honest truth of it. She'd spent 14 years keeping people alive in places that were designed to kill them, and she had gotten extremely good at it. And she had exactly zero interest in hospital politics or administrative turf wars or whatever theater the suits upstairs were currently running. She was 36 years old. She'd done 2 tours in Afghanistan and 1 in Kuwait. She had the kind of tired that 8 hours of sleep did nothing to fix. She wanted to show up, treat her patients, go home to her dog and her small apartment on the east side of Calverton, Idaho, and exist in peace. That plan had lasted about 3 weeks, before Hartwell started making it difficult. The facility itself was military in name and bureaucratic in practice. It occupied a sprawling campus on the south edge of the city, 4 wings, 2 surgical suites, a trauma bay that had been renovated twice in the past decade, and still had HVAC problems in the northern corridor. The signage was crisp, the floors gleamed, and the lobby featured a glass trophy case displaying inspection commendations going back to 2001. Walking through the administrative corridors felt less like a hospital and more like a well-funded public relations office that occasionally treated patients on the side. The staff, though the actual clinical staff were good, overworked and underpaid in the specific way that military medical facilities always managed to be, but competent and dedicated in a way Sarah had recognized instantly. Her ward was post-surgical recovery. 14 beds in the northern wing, a nursing team of 6 split across 2 shifts, and a patient population that was mostly young men and women who had broken themselves in service and were working their way back to something functional. She'd inherited a ward that was doing its job despite its management, not because of it. She'd figured that out in the first week. She didn't say it out loud. The combat patch had been a friction point almost from day one. It was a 75th Ranger Regiment insignia worn on the left shoulder, unit of combat, the way Army doctrine specified. She was civilian nursing staff, technically, but Hartwell's nurses wore a modified service uniform, and she'd cleared the patch policy before accepting the position. HR had told her it was within guidelines. She'd taken the job partly on the basis of that answer. Apparently, someone had subsequently changed his mind. His name was Director Clifford Holt, Operations Chief, no deployment record, 15 years of administrative climbing, and the resultant belief that managing a military medical facility was substantially the same as managing the military. He was 53, wore his dress uniform the way a person wears a costume, with great care for its appearance and no understanding of its weight. He'd been circling Sarah's ward with increasing frequency for 10 days before he stopped her directly on a Tuesday morning in the corridor outside the supply room. "That patch," he said. No greeting, no preamble. Just that. Sarah was carrying a tray of IV supplies. She stopped. "Good morning, Director. I want it removed before end of shift." falls within uniform policy. I verified before I started. I'm aware of what policy says. He had a particular vocal quality. Everything he said came out as a correction, even declarative statements. We have a VIP inspection scheduled for this Friday. I want this wing-looking uniform and professional. That patch, he paused, selecting his word with obvious care, irregular. It's a combat deployment patch. It's standard issue for personnel who served in designated combat zones. It looks like something left over from another context. You look like you're trying to make a point. I'm not trying to make anything. She kept her voice even. I wore it downrange. I wear it here. That's the extent of it. He looked at her the way people look at something they've already decided is going to become a problem. Not quite anger, more like preemptive resentment. End of shift, he said again, and walked away before she could respond. She stood in the corridor and breathed carefully through her nose, a habit she'd built in situations that required her to not say the exact thing she was thinking. Then she went back to her patients. The inspection was the only subject the administrative wing wanted to discuss for the next 72 hours. Rear Admiral Douglas Fenn, 3 stars, career naval officer, currently heading a DoD Medical Readiness Committee, was due to arrive Friday morning. His visit had been on the calendar for 6 weeks. In the days preceding it, Hartwell's administration achieved a level of collective anxiety that Sarah found genuinely impressive. Floors that were already clean got cleaned again. Supply carts were relabeled. The trophy case in the lobby received 3 additional spotlights. Holt issued a facility-wide memo Thursday evening, reminding all staff to maintain uniform standards, address visiting officers by correct title and rank, and ensure patient-facing areas projected, quote, the highest standards of military medical professionalism. Sarah read the memo on the break room tablet, set it down, and went to check on her ward. There was one patient she'd been carrying as a specific concern all week. Private First Class Nolan Torres, 23 years old, 7 days post-op from a shrapnel removal procedure involving his left thigh and lower thorax. He'd developed a low-grade fever 2 days after surgery that wasn't resolving on the expected curve. The surgical team had reviewed him and signed off vitals within acceptable range, wound sites clean, no obvious infection markers at the surgical points. But Sarah had a feeling she'd spent enough years developing to take seriously. It wasn't mystical, it was pattern recognition, the specific calibration that comes from seeing enough situations where something small was actually the early warning of something serious. She'd flagged it with Dr. Marcus Webb, the attending, on Wednesday morning, requested a follow-up chest x-ray. Webb had not yet ordered it. She checked Torres Thursday evening. He was awake, propped against his pillows, working through a crossword puzzle book someone had brought him. He looked pale in a way that wasn't quite right. Pain scale, she said. 4. She waited. He looked at the crossword. 6. Fever's still running. I'm going to make sure you get a chest x-ray tomorrow morning. The doctor said I was fine. The doctor reviewed your surgical sites. I'm talking about your lungs. She checked his oxygen saturation, 93, acceptable, but lower than she wanted for a 23-year-old a week out from surgery. How's the breathing? Normal. Deep breath for me. He did it. She heard the slight resistance at the bottom of his inhalation, the almost imperceptible catch. He didn't seem to notice it. She did. I'll be back in the morning, she said. You need anything in the meantime, that call button is there for a reason. Yes, ma'am. She called Webb from the nurse's station at 9 that night and told him about Torres with the specific unhurried precision she used when she needed someone to understand as she wasn't making a suggestion. His post-op review was clean, Webb said. His fever hasn't broken in 48 hours. His saturation dipped to 92 this afternoon and came back up without intervention. That's a dip I'm not comfortable filing away. A pause. You think it's pulmonary? I think I'd rather be wrong about a chest x-ray than right about a missed pneumonia. Webb was quiet for a moment. She could hear him thinking through the inconvenience of it, the inspection. Tomorrow, the administrative pressure, the surgical team who'd already signed off. I'll order it for first thing in the morning. Tonight would be better. I'll see what I can arrange. He hung up. She stayed until 11. The x-ray was ordered. She went home, fed her dog, and slept 4 hours. Friday arrived the way high-stakes institutional events always do, too early and slightly surreal. By 6:30, the administrative hallways of Hartwell were populated with people moving with the precise, controlled energy of a theater crew in the hour before curtain. Holt had been on site since before 5, according to the nurses' station gossip. The lobby display had been adjusted. The lighting in the trauma wing entrance had been adjusted. Someone had placed a small arrangement of flowers in a military medical facility on the reception desk. Sarah changed in the staff locker room at 6. She put on her uniform with the same order she always did, settled her name badge, and pinned the combat patch to her left shoulder exactly where it lived. She had considered this decision the night before with the same clarity she brought to clinical assessments, and she had reached the same conclusion she always reached when she stripped away the noise. The patch was her record. The patch was her record. It was the 75th Ranger Regiment's insignia worn in a combat zone during a deployment that had cost her things she didn't discuss at work. She was not removing it because a man who had never deployed thought it made his lobby look untidy. She went to the nurse's station and pulled up Torres's overnight results. The radiologist's report had come back at 2 in the morning. She read it, standing at the workstation, the corridor still mostly quiet around her. The early shift nurses beginning to drift in. Early consolidation, lower right lobe, consistent with developing pneumonia. Recommend clinical correlation and antibiotic review. She read it twice. Then she pulled up Torres's medication chart, flagged the radiology findings for doctor Webb with an urgent notation, and wrote a detailed addendum to Torres's care plan, recommending antibiotic escalation and increased respiratory monitoring intervals. She copied the ward charge nurse and left a note for the day shift physician on backup duty in case Webb was delayed. Then she went to see Torres. He was awake. He'd been awake for a while. She could tell there's a particular quality to wakefulness that comes from lying still too long because moving is uncomfortable. He looked worse than the night before. Not dramatically worse. Incrementally, in the specific way that quiet deterioration operates. Morning, she said, moving to his bedside and pulling up his overnight vitals on the wall panel. Morning. His voice had a roughness in it that hadn't been there 2 days ago. Did you sleep? Enough. She checked his chart, his wound sites, listened to his chest. Still that resistance at the base of the right lung, slightly more pronounced. Your x-ray came back. He looked at her. Early pneumonia, developing in your right lung. Not at a critical level yet, but it's moving in a direction I don't want to leave unaddressed. I've already flagged it for Dr. Webb. Someone's going to be in to see you before the morning's done. Torres was quiet for a moment, processing. He was the kind of person she'd seen it in young soldiers before, who took in bad news and sorted through it privately, looking for the operative information. How serious is not critical yet. Manageable, if we get ahead of it today. Concern is pace. This developed faster than the imaging from surgery suggested it might. She kept her voice matter-of-fact, which was a form of respect. He was 23, not 12. You're going to be closely monitored today. That might feel intrusive. Better than the alternative, he said. Yes, it is. She checked his temperature, still elevated, 1.4 degrees over baseline. His saturation read 93. I'll be back in an hour. Call button if anything changes before that. Any chest tightness, shortness of breath, anything that feels different, don't wait for the hour. Got it. He paused. Thank you. For pushing on the x-ray. She nodded and stepped back out into the corridor. The inspection party was due at 9. It was 7:45. She had time if Webb responded quickly, if the If Webb responded quickly, if the medication adjustment was ordered and started before the administrative circus began churning through the ward, if she went to the nurse's station and started her morning checks, working through her 14 patients with the systematic focus she brought to every shift vitals, medication reconciliation, pending labs, outstanding care plan items. Around her, the morning staff settled into their rhythms, and Hartwell's version of a normal Friday began with the addition of a heightened, slightly artificial alertness that came from everyone knowing they were about to be watched. At 8:20, Holt appeared. He walked in from the administrative corridor with the deliberate pace of someone who had been waiting to have this conversation and had timed his arrival for maximum effect. He was in full-dress uniform. The jacket was perfect. His expression was the focused, authoritative look of someone who had practiced it. He stopped 3 feet from the nurse's station and looked at Sarah's left shoulder. "I see we're still having this discussion," he said. 3 nurses at the workstations around Sarah found extremely compelling things to look at on their screens. "I don't think we're having a discussion," Sarah said. She didn't stop what she was doing. She was documenting a medication flag, and the documentation mattered regardless of who was standing next to her. "You gave me an instruction. I've considered it, and I'm declining." He stopped, recalibrated. Nurse Donovan. "I am the operations director of this facility. When I give a directive to clinical staff, it is not optional. Patch is within uniform policy. If that policy has been updated in writing since Thursday, I'd like to see the documentation. I don't need to update policy in writing to, then I'll keep wearing it." She finished the entry, looked up at him. "Is there something patient care related you needed to discuss? Because I have a post-surgical patient who's developing pneumonia that I'm trying to get properly addressed before your inspection. Takes up everyone's attention this morning." His jaw went tight in a way that moved through his whole face. The nurse's station was so quiet she could hear the ventilation. "You have 20 minutes, he said. "Patch off, or I'm having you reassigned to administrative holding for the duration of Admiral Fenn's visit. I'll pull someone from the second shift to cover your ward." Sarah looked at him. She thought about Torres in room 7 with developing pneumonia and an antibiotic plan that hadn't been implemented yet. She thought about pulling someone from second shift, someone who wouldn't know his history, wouldn't know the specific sound of his breathing, wouldn't catch the things she'd spent a week learning to catch. "If you pull me from this ward," she said, and her voice was very quiet, "and something happens to a patient today that a present, informed nurse could have prevented, that's going to be a different kind of conversation than the one you're trying to have right now." The silence lasted 4 seconds. 20 minutes, Holt said, and left. Sarah turned back to her workstation. Her hands were completely steady. She had learned that years ago in places where shaking hands lives. You keep them steady regardless of what the rest of you is doing. At 8:55, Torres's call light came on. She was already moving before she'd fully processed the signal. Some part of her nervous system had been waiting for it, had been tracking the possibility since 6 in the morning. She came through his door at a pace, just below running, and found him sitting forward in bed. One hand pressed flat against his sternum, his breathing wrong in the specific way that made the back of her skull go cold. Short, labored, the chest not rising evenly. "Talk to me," she said, already at his side. "Tight." He stopped, tried again. "Chest is tight. I can't get a full breath in." She had his wrist, checking pulse while her eyes went to the monitor. Oxygen saturation 87, dropping. She leaned across him and hit the call button, twice the emergency signal, and kept her voice level in the way she'd trained herself. Because a nurse who sounds afraid does not help anyone breathe. "Nolan, look at me. That's right eyes here. The breaths you're getting right now are okay. Small is fine. Don't try to force it deep." She pulled the assessment fast percussion on his chest. Right side, the note coming back hyper-resonant where it should have been dull. Breath sounds diminished on the right. trachea midline, but his saturation was at 85 now, and this wasn't pneumonia progressing at a manageable pace anymore. This was something that needed a physician in this room in the next few minutes. "I need a crash cart to room 7, and I need a physician now," she said into the doorway. Loud enough to carry, the voice she'd used in FOBs and field hospitals, and every situation where clear instruction was the difference between order and chaos. A nurse materialized in the doorway, young, first month on the unit, if Sarah had to guess. The particular look of someone whose training hadn't yet had time to overwrite the instinct to freeze. "Webb," Sarah said. "Dr. Webb. Room 7, Torres, respiratory compromise. Right now. Run." The nurse ran. Sarah had the emergency oxygen mask off at bracket and over Torres's face in the same motion, one hand adjusting the seal, her other hand already reaching for the emergency supply cabinet. She was logging in her head time, vital sequence, interventions, the automatic documentation of someone who'd done this enough times that it ran parallel to everything else. Torres's hand found her forearm. His grip wasn't strong. Registered. "You said not dangerous yet," he said, the words coming through the mask, effortful. "I said not yet." It moved faster. She met his eyes. She didn't tell him he was fine. She hadn't earned that statement. "I have you. Stay with me and breathe exactly the way you're breathing now. Don't try to do more than that." 84. She heard it before she saw it, the sound of a delegation moving through a corridor, the cadence of a guided tour, voices in the particular register of official visits. Then they were in the doorway. Admiral Fenn's group, 6 or 7 people in formal uniform, arranged in the corridor the way inspection parties always arranged themselves. And in the middle of them, Holt, whose expression, when he looked into room 7, shifted through surprise and horror and landed on something close to fury. "What is happening in here?" His voice carried the tone of a man watching his carefully constructed afternoon fall apart in real time. Sarah did not look at him, patient in respiratory distress. "I need this corridor cleared, and I need a physician in this room." "The Admiral's party is Director Holt." She said it the way she'd learned to say things when the situation was too serious to be gentle about. Flat, clear, no question built into it. Corridor. Clear now. She felt Holt move forward, rather than saw it. Then a voice from behind the delegation, from the man whose insignia she'd clocked when the group appeared in the doorway at the dairy. The 3 stars she'd been expecting since 9 o'clock. "Stand clear of the doorway." Admiral Fenn's voice was not raised. Didn't need to be. It had the specific gravity of authority that has never needed to perform itself. Let her work. The corridor shuffled back. 82. Sarah leaned over her patient and kept her hands moving and spoke to Torres in the measured, specific way she'd learned in the dark of too many nights that looked exactly like this one felt, and she heard the sound of running footsteps behind her. And Doctor. Webb came through the door, and she stepped exactly 1 foot to the left to give him access while staying within arm's reach of Torres. She gave her report without preamble, vital sequence, timeline from the overnight X-ray to the call light, her physical assessment findings, current saturation, interventions completed. 60 seconds, everything Webb needed to step into the situation with full situational awareness. Webb was already moving, already ordering, already turning toward the doorway to call for additional support. Sarah stayed at Torres's bedside. She was aware, at the edge of her focus, that the corridor was absolutely still. Holt wasn't speaking, that somewhere in the group of people standing outside that door, a 3-star admiral was watching her with an expression that nobody in the hallway had the angle to read properly. Nobody except Sarah, who caught it for half a second when she turned to hand Webb a supply from the cabinet. He was looking at her left shoulder, at the patch. His expression was not the expression of a man observing a uniform irregularity. It was the expression of a man who had seen that insignia before, in a different place, in a context he had not expected to walk into on a Friday morning inspection in Calverton, Idaho. And whatever he recognized, whatever memory had just surfaced behind those three stars. And that carefully composed face, it had changed something in the way he was standing. Sarah turned back to her patient. Torres's saturation read 86, then 86.7, holding. She put her hand on his arm, just above the wrist, and she stayed exactly where she was. Torres's saturation held at 87 for 11 seconds, then climbed to 88. Wasn't a victory, not yet. But it was the number moving in the right direction, and let herself register that for exactly one breath before she went back to work. Webb was ordering a stat respiratory consult and pushing for a transfer to the intermediate care unit, his voice carrying the particular urgency of a physician who had just walked into a situation that was further along than his last chart review had suggested. He wasn't blaming anyone out loud. Sarah wasn't interested in blame right now anyway. She was interested in Torres's next saturation reading, which came up at 89, and in whether the crash cart that had been called was actually going to materialize in the next 60 seconds, or whether someone had gotten sidetracked by the election party, still externist corridor outside. "I need that cart in here," she said, not loudly, to whoever was in range in the doorway. The cart appeared. Pushed by the young nurse who'd run for Webb, she was back, still pale, but moving now, no longer frozen, which Sarah noted and filed away for later. "Good," Sarah said, meaning it. Torres had his eyes on the ceiling. His breathing was still labored, but it had stopped getting worse, which was the best she could say for it. The oxygen mask was doing its job. Webb had his stethoscope out, listening to the right lung bass, his expression doing the thing physician expressions do when the news is not good, but is at least legible. "Right lower lobe is compromised," Webb said. "We need him upstairs." "Agreed. I'm calling respiratory now." Webb stepped toward the window, phone out. Sarah repositioned the oxygen mask half a centimeter. The seal had slipped slightly on the right side, and checked Torres's pulse manually. Old habit. Kind of thing you do when you want a reading that doesn't depend on a machine being correctly calibrated. "You're doing fine," she told him. "I feel like I'm breathing through a wet sock," he said. "That's actually an improvement from 10 minutes ago." He almost laughed. It came out as a cough, which was worse for a second, and then better. Sarah watched his face through it, watched the monitor, and when it settled, she let herself exhale. The corridor outside had reorganized itself in the way that corridors do when authority enters a space and rearranges the social physics. The inspection party had pulled back to the nurse's station, end of the hallway, giving the room a wider berth, and Sarah was aware in her peripheral vision that Holt was standing just outside the doorframe, not gone, not speaking, occupying the particular spatial position of a man who wants to assert presence without committing to any specific action. She ignored him. What she couldn't ignore, and wasn't trying to, was the figure who'd separated slightly from the group, Admiral Fenn, standing with his hands clasped behind his back at the edge of the doorway's sight line, watching the room with the stillness of someone who had decided that this was more important than whatever was next on his agenda. He hadn't spoken since the corridor. He wasn't speaking now. But he was there, and the quality of his attention had a weight to it that Sarah felt without looking directly at it, the way you feel weather before it arrives. The respiratory team showed up 4 minutes later, 2 techs, and a senior therapist named Galloway, who Sarah had worked with before and trusted. She gave him the handoff while Webb finalized the transfer order, and she stood at the foot of Torres's bed, while Galloway ran his own assessment and confirmed what she already knew. "We're moving you to IMC," she told Torres. "It's 1 floor up. Better monitoring, and the respiratory team can be with you faster if anything shifts." "Bad?" he asked. "Direct." He deserved a direct answer. "It's manageable," she said. "Right now, today, it is manageable. The fact that we caught it this morning instead of this afternoon matters. You understand?" He nodded. He had the look of someone absorbing information and trying to sort it into categories that made practical sense, which was exactly what she wanted him doing. "My gear," he said. "Your gear will come with you. I'll make sure of it." He nodded again, and she watched something in his face settle, not relief exactly, just the particular calm of a person who has confirmed that someone is actually paying attention to their situation. She'd seen it before. It never got less significant. They had him on a gurney and moving in 6 minutes. It's like Sarah walked alongside until the elevator, then stood at the hallway junction and watched the doors close, and stayed there for exactly 3 seconds before she turned around. Holt was waiting. He'd moved from the doorway while she was occupied with the transfer, and he was standing now in the middle of the corridor with the posture of someone who has been holding a confrontation in reserve and has decided the moment has arrived. The inspection group had moved further toward the administrative corridor. She could see Admiral Fenn among them, speaking quietly with one of his aides, though she noticed he was positioned at an angle that gave him sightline to this end of the hallway. "My office," Holt said. "Now, I need to brief my team on Torres's care transition first." "That can wait." "No." She said it without heat, without performance. "Can't. There are 13 other patients on this ward, and the team needs a clear handoff on what just happened before anyone gets pulled in a different direction. That takes me 5 minutes. Then your office." His nostrils flared. He was doing the calculation whether to push this in the open corridor, with the Admiral 20 meters away, and capable of witnessing it. He decided against it. 5 minutes, he said. She was at the nurse's station in 40 seconds, giving the charge nurse, a solid 15-year veteran named Pauline Okafor, a clean, precise summary of Torres's situation, his transfer, his current antibiotic status, and what she needed the incoming shift to watch for in the rest of the ward. Pauline listened with her arms crossed and her expression neutral, which was how she always listened, and she asked 2 sharp questions, and Sarah answered them, and the whole thing took 4 minutes and 20 seconds. Then she walked to Holt's office. His office was in the administrative wing, which felt like a different facility, quieter, carpeted, the fluorescent edge taken off by warmer lighting and framed motivational prints that Sarah had the uncharitable thought of noticing. He was already behind his desk when she arrived. He hadn't offered her a chair, and she didn't take one. Started with the patch. "What you did this morning?" "Which part?" she said. He stopped. The part where I identified a patient deteriorating toward respiratory failure from a pneumonia that wasn't caught on his post-op review. Or the part where I refused to take off a combat patch that I am authorized to wear. "You turned a routine inspection visit into a spectacle," he said. "You had a patient emergency in front of the Admiral's entire delegation, in a room with the door open, with minutes." "I had a patient emergency," Sarah said. "I didn't schedule it. I managed it. That's my job. Your job is to function within the protocols of this institution, including. My job is to keep patients alive." She felt the particular stillness that comes when you've decided exactly how far you're going and there's no nervousness left. "I've been doing that for 14 years in places significantly more difficult than this hallway. Nolan Torres's oxygen saturation was at 81 when I intervened. He is in the IMC right now because I pushed for that X-ray last night, and because I was on this ward this morning instead of sitting in administrative holding, because you didn't like my uniform." Holt's face had gone through several colors. He'd settled on something close to contained fury. "I'm initiating a formal conduct review," he said, "for insubordination and failure to comply with a direct administrative directive." Sarah absorbed that. "Okay, you're being moved to restricted duty, pending the outcome. I'd like that in writing. You'll have it. A knock at the door, not a tentative knock. A knock with authority built into it, the kind that arrives without asking whether it's convenient." Holt's eyes went to the door with an expression Sarah found genuinely interesting surprise and something underneath it that was close to alarm. "Come in," he said, after a half second too long. The door opened. It was Admiral Fenn's aide, a lieutenant commander named Brask, young and crisp, with the specific affect of someone delivering a message they are aware is significant. He looked at Holt, then at Sarah, and then back at Holt. "The Admiral would like a word with Nurse Donovan," he said. "When she's available. We're in the middle of. Minus." He said, "When she's available, sir. I believe he's prepared to wait. A beat." He indicated it wasn't urgent, which was a professional way of saying it was. Sarah looked at Holt. "I think we've covered the main points," she said. She walked out before he could respond. Admiral Fenn was in the small conference room off the main corridor, the one that got used for family consultations, and was therefore slightly more human in its furnishings than the rest of the administrative wing. He was seated at the table with a cup of coffee that appeared to be untouched, and he stood when Sarah came in, which was a gesture she hadn't been expecting and didn't quite know what to do with. "Sit down, please," he said. "Both of us. I've been on my feet since 5. She sat. He sat. His aide positioned himself near the door and went professionally invisible. Fenn looked at her for a moment without speaking. He was in his early 60s, she thought, the kind of face that had been weathered by years of squinting into things. Not unkind, not warm exactly, more like a person who had learned to be accurate rather than either. "How's your patient?" he asked. "Transferred to IMC," she said. "Saturation was climbing when he left. Respiratory team has him. Early stage, the timing works in his favor." "Good." He nodded once. That was well done. She didn't deflect it. She also didn't make a big thing of it. "Thank you." He looked at her shoulder, at the patch. He'd been looking at it off and on since the corridor, she was sure of that now, had been sure since the moment she'd caught his expression through Torres's doorway. "Where'd you serve?" he said. "Afghanistan, 2 tours. Kuwait 1. 75th Ranger Support, the first 2. Forward Surgical Attached, the 3rd. What years?" "First Afghanistan tour, 2009 to 2011. Kuwait, 2012. Second Afghanistan, 2013 to 2015. He was quiet. Something behind his eyes was working, the retrieval of something specific, a memory being located and examined. She waited. "There was an incident report," he said, "from a mass casualty event. February 2014. FOB Salerno evacuation corridor." He paused. "Combat medic who made 4 trips back into an exposed area after IDF hit the primary casualty collection point. Each time to bring out a wounded soldier who couldn't be moved on their own." Sarah said nothing. The report described her as working for approximately 6 hours in conditions that should have had her sheltering in place. "She lost 1 patient." He stopped, looked at her carefully. She spent the rest of the incident trying to keep that from happening to anyone else. The room was quiet. Sarah knew the incident. She knew it the way you know something that lives in your body, rather than your memory, not as a story you tell, but as a weight you carry. February 14th. She remembered the cold. She remembered the specific sound of the second impact, and she remembered the soldier she'd lost. And she remembered that she had not left the evacuation corridor until every living person in her sector had been moved to Xnasticton. And she remembered nothing about being particularly brave, and everything about being completely terrified the entire time. "That report was classified for operational reasons," she said carefully. "Was. I was on the review board that read it." He looked at her steadily. The medic was listed by rank and service number. The narrative was detailed enough that when I saw your patch this morning, he paused. It took me a moment, but I recognized the unit, and the timeline matches. She met his eyes. She didn't confirm or deny. There was nothing useful to say. "The bloodstain on that patch," he said, with a quietness that wasn't theatrical. "I'd imagine that has a story." "Several," she said. "The soldier you lost in that corridor," he said. "Was that one of them?" Something tightened in her chest. Not breaking, she'd had years to build the architecture around it, but it was there, present, the particular grief of a specific moment that doesn't fade the way other things do. She'd been 27. She'd had her hands on specialist Derek Ullman's chest for 40 minutes. She'd known he was gone before the helicopter arrived, and she'd kept working anyway because stopping felt like a decision she wasn't willing to make. Yes, she said. Fenn nodded slowly. He didn't say he was sorry, which she appreciated. He said, "You've been here 4 months, 3.5, and Holt has been after you since week 2, roughly." Which was the most recent point of friction. What were the others? She thought about how to answer that. Answered that, and then decided that this man had read incident report detailed enough to recognize her from a blood-stained patch on a Friday morning, and that he probably deserved a straight answer. I flagged understaffing on the overnight shift twice in writing. I requested a maintenance review of the HVAC in the trauma corridor. It's been failing intermittently, and temperature regulation matters for post-op patients. Pushed back on a documentation policy that was creating gaps in medication reconciliation. She paused. None of those went anywhere. The patch was the thing that made it personal for him. Fenn at his untouched coffee. Fenn looked at his untouched coffee. He was thinking. She could tell the organized, sequential thinking of someone assembling a picture from pieces that have just been laid in front of them. Director Holt informed me, in the briefing this morning before we reached your ward, Hartwell's northern wing has had no significant adverse events. In the past 18 months, he said. That's accurate. He also indicated that staff concerns about resource allocation have been reviewed and addressed. Sarah said nothing. Fenn looked at her. That's also the statement of a man who believes that not documenting a problem is the same as resolving it. Still, she said nothing. She didn't need to. He picked up the coffee cup, looked at it, set it down without drinking. I'm going to want to speak with your charge nurse and 2 or 3 members of your clinical team. Separately, without Holt present. Can you tell me who would give me an honest account? Pauline Okafor, Sarah said immediately. 15 years on this ward. She's been here longer than anyone in administration. She paused. Dr. Webb would tell you the truth, too, if he felt like the conversation was genuinely confidential. He's cautious. He has reasons to be. Fenn nodded. He reached into his jacket pocket and put a card on the table, plain, rank, and contact, nothing elaborate. If anything changes in your situation today, anything formal comes through from Holt's office, I want to know before it's processed. She looked at the card. Then she picked it up. He told me he's initiating a conduct review, she said, for insubordination. Fenn's expression didn't change dramatically. But something in it went very still, in the way that very controlled people go still when they've heard exactly what they expected to hear and find it no less significant for having expected it. I see, he said. He stood. She stood. The work you did in that room this morning, he said, was the kind of work this facility exists to support. He looked at her shoulder one more time. Don't remove that patch. She met his eyes. I wasn't going to. She was back on the ward by 11. Pauline caught her at the nursery professionally. Pauline caught her at the station with the look of someone who had information she'd been holding and needed somewhere to put it. Holt's assistant came by, Pauline said, voice low. Dropped off a formal notice of restricted duty, pending conduct review. Told her you were unavailable and signed for it. Sarah took the envelope. She didn't open it. She already knew what it said. Also, Pauline said, 2 of the Admiral's people have been in the corridor for the last 20 minutes. Not doing anything, just there. Sarah looked toward the corridor junction. There were, in fact, 2 uniformed officers standing at a position that could be described as casual, and was obviously not. One of them met her eyes briefly and looked away. Okay, she said. What's happening? Pauline asked. Sarah considered how much to say. Pauline had been doing this job for 15 years and deserved a straight answer, but Sarah also wasn't sure yet what shape the next few hours were going to take. She knew what Holt thought he was doing. She knew what was in the envelope. She didn't know yet what Fenn was going to do with the conversation they'd just had, and she'd learned a long time ago not to count on things that hadn't happened yet. I'm not sure, she said, which was almost true. Keep your head down and do your job. If anyone asks you anything official, tell the truth. Pauline looked at her for a long moment. You know, I always tell the truth. I know. I was saying it for my own benefit. Pauline made a sound that was not quite a laugh and went back to her station. Sarah spent the next hour doing exactly what she would have done on any other Friday, running her ward, checking her patients, managing the 2-hour lag in Torres's updated care plan that needed reconciling now that he was in IMC. Called up to IMC twice. His saturation was at 91 and climbing. The antibiotics were running. Galloway thought they'd caught it well enough. She ate half a sandwich at her workstation at 12:30 and drank a full cup of coffee, which she normally didn't bother with after 10. At 12:58, Holt appeared at the ward entrance with 2 people she didn't recognize, not clinical staff, not the inspection party. One was carrying a tablet and taking notes. The other had the specific quality of someone from HR, whose job was to witness things officially. Holt looked at Sarah. Sarah looked at Holt. He walked toward her, and he had the expression of a man who had spent the last 2 hours organizing himself and was now arriving with the intention of finishing something. Nurse Donovan, he said, in light of the conduct review initiated this morning, you are formally relieved of patient responsibilities for the remainder of this shift. You are to Director Holt. The voice came from the corridor behind him. Fenn's aide, Lieutenant Commander Brask, was standing at the ward entrance. Admiral Fenn was 3 steps behind him, and behind Fenn were 2 more officers Sarah hadn't seen before, one of them carrying a leather document case. Holt turned. The color in his face did something complicated. Admiral, he said, I wasn't aware you were still here, yes. Fenn walked past Brask and stopped 6 feet from Holt, and his voice had the quality Sarah had noticed in the conference room, not raised, never raised, but carrying the kind of density that silence organizes itself around. I have some concerns about this facility that I'd like to address before I leave. One of them involves you. Holt's mouth opened, then closed. I've spent the last 90 minutes speaking with members of your clinical staff, Fenn said. I've also reviewed the maintenance logs for the Northern Wing and the staffing records for the past 6 months. He paused, and the pause had weight. I found some things I'd like to discuss. Sarah stayed very still at her workstation. She was aware of Pauline, 3 feet to her left, also very still. She was aware of 2 other nurses at the far end of the station who had stopped typing. Holt was looking at Fenn with the expression of a man who has just realized that the ground under the building he's standing in has a different foundation than he believed. Of course, Holt said carefully. My office. Here is fine, Fenn said. And the ward, which had been operating at its own busy frequency all morning, went very, very quiet. Holt's HR witness was still holding his tablet. The note-taker had stopped writing. Fenn reached back, and the aide with the document case stepped forward, and Fenn took from him a single printed page and looked at it briefly before looking back at Holt. This conduct review you've initiated against Nurse Donovan, Fenn said. I'd like you to walk me through the specific violations you're citing. Holt straightened. Insubordination. Failure to comply with a direct administrative directive regarding uniform standards. Disruptive behavior during a VIP inspection visit. She managed a patient emergency. She created a visible spectacle in front of. She managed a patient emergency, Fenn said again, with the exact same intonation, and it wasn't louder, and it wasn't harder, but something about the repetition made Holt stop. A young soldier who is currently in your intermediate care unit with a developing pneumonia that her clinical judgment identified and her persistence ensured was properly investigated. I spoke with the radiologist this morning. The X-ray she pushed for was ordered last night. Without it, Private Torres would likely have been in your emergency bay this afternoon instead of your IMC this morning. Holt said nothing. I'm also looking at 2 written maintenance requests she submitted regarding the HVAC system in this corridor, Fenn continued. that were filed and not actioned. I'm looking at a staffing concern she raised in week 3 of her employment that has no documented response. He set the paper down on the nurse's station counter, right next to Sarah's workstation, without looking at her. What I'm not looking at is a pattern of insubordination. What I'm looking at is a pattern of a competent clinical professional raising legitimate operational concerns and being managed out rather than heard. Holt's composure was cracking at the edges in the specific way that composure cracks when the structure it was built on turns out to be thinner than expected. He was recalculating, Sarah could see it, trying to find the position that salvaged something. The patch he started is within uniform policy, Fenn said, as she told you, as HR told her when she accepted this position. It was a distraction during an important. It is a 75th Ranger Regiment combat insignia, Fenn said, and now his voice did change, not louder, but something tighter, something with a different edge underneath it, worn by a nurse who made 4 trips back into an exposed casualty corridor under indirect fire to bring out wounded soldiers who could not move on their own. Patch, he paused, and the pause was not for effect. It was because he was choosing the next word with precision. Belongs exactly where it is. The ward was so quiet, Sarah could hear the ventilation. Holt's face had gone through the last of its colors and landed somewhere pale and still. And from the far end of the nurse's station, the young nurse, the one who had frozen in Torres's doorway at 8:55 and then unfrozen and run, was standing very straight, looking at Admiral Fenn, and Sarah saw her eyes go to the patch on Sarah's shoulder, and then to Holt, and something shift in the young woman's face that Sarah recognized from the inside, because she had felt it herself once. A long time ago, the particular recognition of understanding, for the first time, exactly who the right person in the room actually was. Holt opened his mouth, and his phone rang. He looked at the screen with the expression of a man who has just been handed an unexpected lifeline, and Sarah watched his face change again as he read the name on the display, something she couldn't see, but whatever it was made him go a different kind of still. He looked at Fenn, then at Sarah, then back at Fenn. "I need to take this," he said. Fenn said nothing. Holt stepped back toward the corridor junction and raised the phone to his ear, and Sarah watched him listen. And she watched his posture change in the first 5 seconds of that call in the specific way that bodies change when they receive information that alters the geography of their situation completely. He didn't say much. He said yes twice. He said understood once. When he lowered the phone and turned back, his face was a different face than the one that had arrived at her nurse's station 40 minutes ago with an HR witness and a printed conduct review. He looked at Admiral Fenn, and then he looked at Sarah. And the expression on his face in that moment was the last thing she had expected to see there. Not anger, not calculation, not the controlled authority of a man who believed he held the position of power in this corridor. It was something she could only describe later as the look of a man who has just realized exactly what he has done. The look lasted maybe 3 seconds. Then Holt straightened, put his phone in his pocket, and said, "I need to step away for a moment," to no one in particular, and walked toward the administrative corridor with the deliberate pace of a man trying very hard not to appear to be retreating. Nobody stopped him. Fenn watched him go with an expression that didn't change, which was its own kind of statement. His aide, Brask, made a note on his tablet. The HR witness and the note-taker exchanged a look that carried a full conversation in about a quarter of a second, and then both of them found reasons to be somewhere else. Sarah stayed at her workstation. She was aware that the ward had been holding its breath for the better part of the last 10 minutes and was now very carefully exhaling. Pauline had gone back to her charts with the focused attention of someone who understood that the most professional thing she could do right now was act like she hadn't heard all of that. 2 nurses at the far end of the station had resumed typing. The young nurse Sarah still didn't know her name, had been meaning to learn it, and kept getting interrupted by the day, had disappeared back toward the patient rooms. Fenn approached the workstation. "I'm going to need a quiet space for the next hour," he said. Somewhere I can make calls without going back through the administrative wing." "Family consultation room," Sarah said. "End of the corridor, last door on the left. Should be empty. Thank you." He picked up the printed page he'd set on the counter, the one with the maintenance logs and staffing records, and looked at it briefly. The HVAC request. "You submitted this in writing?" "Week 4, through the facilities portal. I have the submission confirmation in my email. I'll need that forwarded." She wrote down her contact information on a notepad, old habit, faster than navigating the internal system, and handed it to him. He took it without ceremony and turned toward the corridor. He stopped after 2 steps. "The conduct review," he said, without turning around. "Don't respond to it formally yet. Give me the afternoon." She didn't ask what he meant by that. She understood what he meant by that. "Okay," she said. He walked to the end of the corridor and went into the consultation room and closed the door, and that was the last Sarah saw of him. For 2 hours and 40 minutes, turned out to be the longest 2 hours and 40 minutes of her time at Hartwell Military Medical Center so far. She ran the ward. That was what she did, because it was what there was to do, and because Fort patients didn't stop having needs, because their nurse was in the middle of something complicated. She managed a dressing change on a post-surgical patient in room 3 who developed a reaction to the adhesive and needed a different protocol. She coordinated with the pharmacy on a medication substitution for room 9. She got an update from IMC on torus saturation 93 and holding, fever, beginning to respond to the antibiotic escalation. Respiratory team satisfied with the trajectory and relayed it to Pauline and logged it in his chart. She did not open the envelope from Holt's office. It sat on the corner of the nurse's station counter where Pauline had placed it, and Sarah was aware of something that is waiting for you without actively thinking about it. Conduct review, insubordination, formal restricted duty. She knew what the document said because she'd been in enough institutional situations to know exactly how they were written, and she'd made her decision on how to handle it before Fenn had told her to wait. So waiting was not difficult. What was difficult, in a quieter and more private way, was the conversation in the consultation room. February 2014. FOB Salerno. 4 trips back into the corridor. She hadn't talked about that in 4 years. Hadn't talked about it to anyone. Actually, not to a therapist. Not to another veteran. Not to her sister, who called every Sunday and asked careful questions and accepted careful non-answers. It lived in the category of things she'd organized very precisely and put somewhere she could function around. She'd gotten good at that. You got good at it, or you didn't keep working, and she'd chosen to keep working. Derek Ullman had been 21 years old. He'd been from Pensacola. He'd had a photograph of his dog in his breast pocket that was still there when Sarah had her hands on his chest, and she'd known within the first 10 minutes that the injury was not survivable, and she'd kept working for 30 more. Because you kept working until someone told you to stop or the helicopter arrived, whichever came first. The helicopter had arrived. She'd been the one to stop. She did not think about this often. She was thinking about it now because someone had named it out loud in a room, and she hadn't been prepared for how it would feel to hear it named. Not bad, exactly. More like locating. The specific sensation of something you've been carrying being briefly acknowledged as real weight. She turned back to her patient chart. Room 6 needed a reassessment on his pain management protocol. Pulled the file. At 2:15, doctor. Webb appeared at the nurse's station with the energy of a man who had been thinking about something for several hours and had arrived at a conclusion he wasn't comfortable with. He was a decent physician. Sarah had assessed that in her first week, technically solid, appropriately cautious, limited by an institutional culture that did not particularly reward the raising of concerns. He was 44, had been at Hartwell for 7 years, and he'd learned in those 7 years to practice a certain kind of medicine that stayed within the lines Holt had drawn. Torres had been outside those lines. She'd felt that in the phone call Wednesday night, the specific resistance of someone who wanted to help but was doing the math on what helping would cost. Stood it at the counter and looked at the sealed envelope, and then at Sarah. Torres's numbers are better, he said. I know. I called up at noon. He put his hands in his coat pockets. I wanted to say he stopped. Started again. The X-ray. You were right to push on it. I should have ordered it Wednesday. She looked at him. He was uncomfortable with this, which she respected. It was easier to not say it. You ordered it when I called Thursday night, she said. I ordered it for the morning. You wanted it that night. Came back in time. This time, he said, and that was the honest part, the part that had been sitting with him all day. She let it sit. He had to carry it, not her. She couldn't carry it for him. The Admiral's team talked to me this morning, he said. One of his people. A medical officer. I know. They asked about the staffing. The overnight coverage gaps. He paused. I told them what I knew. Good. Holt's going to know I talked. Holt has other things to deal with right now, Sarah said, which was as much as she was willing to say, because she didn't actually know what Fenn was doing in that consultation room, and she wasn't going to speculate out loud. Webb nodded slowly. He looked at the envelope again. Are you in serious trouble? I'm in the kind of trouble that depends on how the next few hours go, she said. He absorbed that. He was a careful man, and careful men understood the shape of uncertain outcomes. Is there anything you need from me? She thought about it honestly. If anyone asks you officially about what happened in Torres's room this morning, what you observed when you arrived, tell it exactly as it happened. Don't manage it. Just the facts, the timeline, the clinical picture. I can do that. That's all I need. He nodded once more and went back toward the clinical corridor, and Sarah watched him go and thought that he was probably a better doctor than this institution had let him be, and that was its own particular kind of waste. At 3:40, two things happened within 4 minutes of each other. First was that Pauline appeared at Sarah's shoulder and said, quietly, someone just came and cleared out Holt's office. 2 people with boxes. His assistant looked like she'd been crying. Sarah didn't respond immediately. She was checking a medication dosage, and she finished checking it before she looked up. Okay, that's all you're going to say. What would you like me to say? Pauline made the sound again, the not quite law, and went back to her work. The second thing was that the young nurse appeared at the edge of the nurse's station, still in her scrubs, the end of her shift approaching. And she stood there for a moment with the body language of someone who has something to say and isn't sure of the protocol. Can I ask you something? She said. Sarah looked at her. She was maybe 24, 25. Name badge, said Kay. Aldridge. Go ahead this morning. In room 7. She paused. When you came in and his sats were dropping, you didn't hesitate at all. How do you do that? Sarah considered the question. It deserved a real answer, not a reassuring one. I did hesitate, she said. For about half a second when I saw the number on the monitor. There was a half second where my brain was doing the thing brains do when something is worse than you expected. And then I moved, because moving is what stops the hesitation from taking over. Aldridge absorbed that. I froze. You froze for about 8 seconds. Then you ran for the doctor and you came back with the crash cart. Sarah looked at her steadily. 8 seconds of freeze and then correct action is not failure. 8 seconds of freeze and then nothing is failure. You did the second thing. Aldridge was quiet. Whatever she'd come to the station carrying was shifting into something different on her face. Still difficult, but differently shaped. Patch, she said. What the Admiral said about the corridor was that she stopped. I don't know if that's okay to ask. It's okay. Is that why the blood stain is there? Sarah looked at her left shoulder, the patch. Faded to the brown-green of old camouflage, the edges worn, the blood stain darkened to a rust color that had stopped looking like blood years ago. "Part of it," she said. Aldridge nodded, and something in her expression settled the particular settling of a person who has just updated their understanding of what they're looking at. "I'm sorry," Aldridge said, meaning something specific. "Don't be," Sarah said, meaning something specific back. Just be better the next time you're in a room like that. That's the only thing that matters." Aldridge nodded and went back to the patient corridor, and Sarah watched her go and thought that she was going to be fine, given time and the right conditions, which this institution had not exactly been providing. 4:10, Fenn came out of the consultation room. He walked the full length of the corridor to the nurses' station, and he was carrying the document case that his aide had brought in the leather folder, and his expression was the expression of a man who has spent 3 hours making phone calls and is now in possession of a clear picture that he didn't entirely enjoy looking at. He stopped at the counter. "Director Holt has been temporarily relieved of his operational duties pending a formal DoD review," he said. "The hospital's executive director has been notified and will be implementing interim leadership by end of business today." Sarah kept her face neutral. She'd had some version of this in the back of her head as a possibility, but hearing it said plainly in a hospital corridor was a different thing than thinking it. "Conduct review against you," Fenn continued, "has been suspended. Given the circumstances under which it was initiated, I expect it will be formally withdrawn." "Okay," she said. He set the document case on the counter and opened it, and Sarah saw that it contained not just printed pages, but what looked like a facility assessment report, multi-page, tabbed, with handwritten notes in the margins. "I'm going to recommend a full operational review of this facility," he said. "Clinical staffing, maintenance backlog, emergency protocol compliance. It'll take 3 months, and it won't be comfortable." He looked at her. "The things you flagged in weeks 3 and 4, they're going to be part of that record. They should be. There'll be an interview process. You'll be asked to give a formal account. I understand." He looked at the patch. He'd looked at it 6 or 7 times today. She realized, not in a focused way, more the way you look at something that keeps pulling at the edge of your attention. "I want to tell you something," he said, and his voice dropped a register, the formality of it easing slightly in the way it had in the consultation room when they were talking without the institutional weight between them. That incident report from Salerno. The review board had a discussion about whether to push for a formal commendation through the chain. It didn't happen for reasons that were mostly operational and bureaucratic, and he paused. Not good enough in retrospect. Sarah looked at him. She didn't know what to do with that information, so she let it sit. "I'm not saying that to create an obligation," he said. "I'm saying it because I think you should know that the people who read that report understood what it documented." She thought about Derek Ullman's photograph, his dog. She thought about the cold of the corridor and the specific sound of the second impact and the 40 minutes she'd spent doing something she'd known wasn't going to work. "It didn't feel commendable at the time," she said. "Felt like not enough." "It usually does," Fenn said. They looked at each other across the nurses' station counter, and there was something in that exchange not comfortable exactly, but honest that most exchanges in this building hadn't been today. That lasted a moment longer than professional distance typically allowed. Then Brask appeared at the corridor entrance with the expression of someone managing a schedule that was now significantly behind. "Sir," he said, "the vehicle's ready." Fenn closed the document case. He straightened. The full uniform gravity came back, the 3 stars and the institutional weight of everything they represented. He looked at Sarah one last time. "Keep doing your job," he said. "That was always the plan," she said. He left. Brask followed. 2 officers who had been stationed in the corridor throughout the afternoon fell in behind them, and the sound of the delegation moving through Hartwell's main corridor faded, and the ward exhaled again longer this time, deeper, the specific quality of a space that has been under pressure for 8 hours and has been given permission to release it. Sarah sat down, not dramatically. She just sat in the chair at the nurse's station because she had been on her feet since 6 in the morning. And it was now 4:23 in the afternoon, and her back hurt. And the coffee she'd had at 12:30 had been the last food or drink she'd had since the half sandwich, and she was tired in the specific way that comes from spending a day at maximum alertness. Pauline set a cup of tea on the counter next to her. Sarah looked at it. "Thank you. Don't thank me. I made it for myself and then decided you needed it more. Still, thank you. Drink it before it gets cold." Sarah drank it. It was too hot. She drank it anyway. The interim director, a woman named Lois Kerrigan, who'd been the facility's chief of clinical operations for 11 years and apparently had been notified by phone somewhere around 3:30, arrived at 4:45. She was 58, had the look of someone who had been functioning in a difficult environment for a long time without anyone paying particular attention to whether she had what she needed, and she came to the northern ward first, which Sarah noted. She introduced herself with the efficiency of someone who didn't have time for performance. "Lois Kerrigan, I've been briefed on today's events. I want to speak with you and your charge nurse together when you have a moment." "Now works," Sarah said. They used the nurse's station break room, small, fluorescent, smelling of the same institutional coffee smell as every break room Sarah had ever been in. Kerrigan sat, pulled out a notepad, and asked direct questions in the order they mattered. Patient outcomes first, staffing situation second, the HVAC and maintenance issues third, the conduct review fourth. She listened without interrupting, which was not as common a quality as it should have been in people who held her kind of position. When Sarah finished, Kerrigan looked at her notes. The HVAC in the trauma corridor. "How long has it been failing?" "Intermittently since I started. Pauline says it's been an ongoing issue for about 8 months. Pauline confirmed this with a single nod. "And Torres," Kerrigan said. "He's stable? As of 4 o'clock, yes. Saturation climbing, fever responding." "Good." Kerrigan closed her notepad. "I want to be clear about something. What happened today, the conduct review, the removal of your ward privileges, the pressure regarding the patch, none of that is going to be treated as a closed matter just because Director Holt has been relieved. There will be a process." She looked at Sarah steadily. "You may find parts of that process uncomfortable, even if the outcome is favorable to you. Do you have documentation of the concerns you raised? The written requests? The flagged care plan issues? Everything's in the system. I can pull timestamps." "Do that." Kerrigan stood. "I'll be on site through the weekend. If anything comes up on your ward that you'd normally have escalated to Holt's office, escalate it directly to me until an interim structure is in place." "Okay." Kerrigan looked at the patch. She didn't say anything about it, but her expression was different from Holt's when she looked at it, not the look of something irregular, more the look of someone reading a page of text and understanding what it says. She left, and Sarah and Pauline sat in the break room for a moment in the specific silence of people, specific silent who have just been through a great deal together. "Months," Sarah said finally. "The HVAC? Yeah. 8 months of putting it in the request system and watching it go nowhere." Pauline's voice was neutral, not bitter exactly. The tone of someone who has gotten very precise between things they can change and things they cannot. "We had a patient in room 11 in January who spiked a post-op fever that I spent 2 hours attributing to the wrong thing because the core temperature was running 6 degrees above what it should have been. Webb and I caught it eventually. But those 2 hours..." She stopped. "They matter," Sarah said. "They matter," Pauline agreed. The fluorescent light buzzed once. They both ignored it. "You knew, didn't you?" Pauline said. "When you wouldn't take the patch off. You knew it was going to land somewhere like this." Sarah thought about it honestly. I knew it was going to land somewhere. I didn't know exactly where. She looked at the patch. I just knew that if I took it off, because a man who'd never been shot at told me it was distracting, then everything it stood for was worth less. And I wasn't willing to make that trade. Pauline was quiet for a moment. The soldier who died. In that corridor. Sarah waited. Do you think he'd know? That you're still... Pauline stopped, apparently uncertain how to finish the question. Still carrying it? Still doing it like it matters. Sarah looked at the table. The honest answer was that she didn't know what Derek Ullman would have thought about anything, because she'd spent exactly 43 minutes with him on the worst night of both their lives, and she had no way of knowing who he'd been outside of that. But she thought about his photograph, the dog. I think he'd just want someone to be paying attention, she said. To the next one. That's all anyone really wants. Pauline picked up her notepad. Breaks over, she said, which was her way of saying that was enough honest conversation for one afternoon, and Sarah appreciated it. They went back to the ward. At 5:55, with Sarah 20 minutes from the end of her shift and finishing her documentation, her phone buzzed with an internal message from the IMC. She opened it, expecting an update on Torres. It was from Galloway, the respiratory therapist, and it was 3 lines long. Torres asking about you. Wanted to know if you were still on shift. I said I'd check. Also, you need to see his 6 p.m. chest film when it comes back. Something's changed. Not bad changed. But you should see it. She stared at the message. Not bad changed. She typed back, I'll come up when the film is ready. She set her phone down and finished her documentation, but her mind was already in the IMC, running through the possibilities of what a chest film could show at the 6-hour mark of antibiotic treatment in an early-stage pneumonia that had already been responding well to therapy. Not bad change could mean a lot of things. Galloway was precise. He wouldn't have flagged it if it wasn't worth flagging. 6:12, she got the notification that the film was up in the system. She pulled it on the workstation, and she sat very still for a moment, looking at the image, and then she pulled Torres's previous films and laid them side by side, and she looked at the comparison for a long moment. Then she called the IMC directly. Galloway picked up on the second ring. You're looking at it, he said. I'm looking at it, she said. Tell me your read. My read is that the consolidation pattern in the lower right lobe is doing something I haven't seen move this fast in an early presentation. That's not the pneumonia responding to antibiotics. That's something else. I know, she said. You've seen this before. It wasn't a question. She'd gone still in the specific way that comes from recognition from a pattern assembling itself out of data points that individually looked like one thing and collectively looked like something significantly different. What's his temperature right now? She said. She heard Galloway check. 38.4, down from 38.9 at 5 o'clock. Heart rate? 110. That's up from this morning. Yes. And his pain assessment? He said 4 when I asked at 5:30. But he's been quiet. Kind of quiet that isn't comfortable quiet. Sarah was already logging out of her workstation and picking up her badge. I'm coming up. I thought you might be. She hung up. She looked at Pauline, who was 10 minutes from her own shift end and processing handoff notes. I need to check something in the IMC, Sarah said. Stay an extra 15 minutes? Pauline looked at her face. What is it? I'm not sure yet. She grabbed her stethoscope. Why I'm going up. She was in the elevator at 6:15. The IMC was 1 floor up and organized differently from her ward 8 beds, higher monitoring ratios. The background frequency of equipment, a register higher than post-surgical recovery. She pushed through the doors and found Galloway outside Torres's room. Torres's room with his tablet and an expression she recognized. The expression of someone who has been watching a situation and doesn't like the direction it's moving. He's been deteriorating in a way that doesn't fit the pneumonia picture, Galloway said immediately. Incrementally. Nothing that triggers the alarm thresholds individually. But I've been watching it and the aggregate. I know, Sarah said. Where's his attending? Dr. Nair took over when he transferred. She's been paged. Hasn't responded in 20 minutes. Sarah looked through the window into Torres's room. He was lying flat, which was wrong for a patient with a respiratory issue. That position worked against him. He was conscious. She could see that. But his face had the gray-edged quality she associated with people who were burning significant reserves just to stay level. Pushed the door open. He looked at her when she entered. Something in his expression shifted, not relief exactly, more like the recognition that a specific person was in the room, which was different from just having someone there. Hey, he said. His voice was rougher than it had been at noon. Hey. She was already at his side, checking his wrist, watching the monitor. Heart rate 113. Saturation 91, it had been 93 2 hours ago. How are you feeling right now? Honest. Worse than this morning. He stopped. My back hurts, which is weird because it's my chest that minus... Which side? Right. Sarah straightened. She looked at the monitor. She looked at the chest film she'd been carrying in her head since she'd pulled it up 8 minutes ago, and she looked at the aggregate of everything she'd been tracking on this patient since Monday, and the picture assembled itself with the cold clarity of a diagnosis that arrives, not like a revelation, but like the inevitable endpoint of a line of reasoning you've been following for days. Turned to Galloway in the doorway. Get me, doctor. Nair on the phone directly, she said. Not a page. Call her, and I need a senior resident up here in the next 5 minutes. Galloway was already moving. Sarah put her stethoscope in and listened to Torres's right lung bass. Then his left, then his right again. Cussed his back. She watched his face during the percussion and noted where he flinched. Nolan, she said, I need to ask you something, and I need you to think carefully before you answer, say. In the last 2 hours, has it gotten harder to breathe, or has the pain in your back gotten worse? Which one changed first? He thought about it. Really thought, the way she'd asked him to. Maybe an hour ago, and then the breathing got worse after. Sarah nodded once. This was not pneumonia progressing. This was something that had been building alongside the pneumonia, or perhaps underneath it, masked by the presentation of the more obvious pathology, something that the initial post-op imaging had not caught, that the overnight chest film had shown only the early edges of, that the 6 p.m. film now displayed with enough clarity that she could not look at it and see anything other than what it was. She had been right to push for the X-ray on Wednesday. She had been right about all of it. And this specific thing, right now, was the thing she should have had a surgeon looking at 8 hours ago, and instead had a respiratory therapist watching alone on a Friday evening, while the attending physician wasn't answering her pages. She straightened up and looked at Torres. He was watching her face, smotching her with the careful attention of someone who has learned to read medical staff expressions, because their body is the thing at stake. What is it? He said. She was about to answer when the door opened behind her and Doctor Nair came in, not hurrying, with the expression of someone who has been interrupted from something and has not yet been given a reason to elevate the priority. She was 40, capable, had arrived at Hartwell 2 years ago from a larger facility in Portland, and had been practicing the same careful in the lines medicine that the culture here seemed to require. She looked at Sarah with the mild confusion of someone who didn't recognize her from this floor. Who are you? Sarah Donovan, post-surgical ward, North Wing. I transferred this patient this morning, and I've been following his case. He's my patient now. I know. And I need you to look at his 6 p.m. chest film. Sarah kept her voice even. Right now. Before anything else, Nair looked at her with the expression of someone recalibrating whether this was a request or something with more weight behind it. Sarah held her ground. Now, she said. Nair pulled up the film on the room's wall display. She looked at it. She looked at the previous film. She was quiet for 10 seconds, 15. And Sarah watched her face go through the same progression of recognition that Sarah's own had gone through 8 minutes ago. The slow assembly of a picture that resolved into something neither of them wanted to be seeing. When Nair turned around, her expression was different. "How long has he been showing the back pain?" she said. "He says approximately 1 hour, and his SATs have been dropping incrementally. 93 at noon, 91 now." Nair looked at Torres, then at the monitor, then at the film again. "I need to call surgery," she said, and there was nothing casual in her voice anymore. And in the second before she reached for her phone, Sarah saw at the specific moment when a physician stops managing a situation and starts treating it as the emergency it actually is, and she felt, underneath the urgency and the clinical precision and the sheer exhaustion of a day that had started before 6 in the morning, something that was not quite relief but was adjacent to it. Not because she'd been right. Because Torres had a chance. Nair was on the phone. Sarah was at the bedside. Torres was looking at her with the expression of someone who has understood from the change in the room's frequency that the situation has just become significantly more serious than anyone had told him. "What is it?" he said again. She looked at him straight. "There's a complication from your surgery," she said. "Something that was missed on the initial imaging. Dr. Nair is getting a surgical team together right now." "Is it?" He stopped. "You're in a hospital with people who are now looking directly at the right problem," she said. "Position you want to be in." He was quiet. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. She meant it as clinical reassurance. She meant it as something else too, and he seemed to understand both things at once because he nodded and looked at the ceiling and did the thing soldiers do. He organized himself internally for what was coming next. Down the corridor, she heard the sound of rapid footsteps. Surgical resident, she thought, or Galloway coming back, or someone from the nursing station who'd been alerted by the page Nair had just sent. Sarah's phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out. The number on the screen was 1. She didn't recognize not an internal Hartwell extension, not a number in her contacts. She stared at it for half a second. Then she noticed the area code. It was a Washington, D.C. number. She looked at the screen. The call went to 3 rings, 4, and then stopped. Beat of silence. Then it rang again. She let it ring a 3rd time before she answered. "Donovan," she said. Pause. Then a voice she didn't recognize, male, measured the specific cadence of someone who spends most of their professional life on the phone and has gotten very efficient about it. "Nurse Donovan. My name is Colonel Patrick Reese. I'm calling from the Office of the Inspector General for the Department of Defense. I apologize for the hour." He didn't sound particularly apologetic. He sounded like a man moving through a list of that needed to happen before the end of a business day. "I've been briefed on the situation at Hartwell Military Medical Center by Admiral Fenn's office. I have a few questions, if you have a moment." Sarah looked at Torres, who was watching the ceiling, with controlled patience while Dr. Nair stood at the wall display, cross-referencing his imaging with a surgical resident who had arrived 90 seconds ago and was doing the rapid visual assessment of someone who has walked into a room and immediately understood that the situation is time-sensitive. "I have a moment," Sarah said. She stepped back from the bedside and positioned herself in the corner of the room where she could see Torres and keep her voice low simultaneously. "I'll be brief," Reese said. "Admiral Fenn's team has filed a preliminary report citing several areas of concern at Hartwell. Your name appears in that report in the context of patient safety, advocacy, and administrative resistance. I want to give you the opportunity to speak to that directly before the report is formalized. What specifically do you want to know?" "The maintenance requests. Conduct review initiated against you this morning." A pause. "And the timeline of Private Torres's care. From your first clinical concern to this afternoon," she told him. She did it the same way she'd told Fenn, in order, without editorializing, with specific dates and times where she had them. She told him about the Monday fever, the Wednesday phone call to Webb, the X-ray she'd pushed for, the overnight results. the morning deterioration, the transfer. She told him about the 6 p.m. chest film and where she was standing right now while she spoke to him. He asked 2 clarifying questions. Both were precise, which told her he'd already reviewed some version of the documentation before making this call. "One more thing," he said. "Director Holt, in your assessment, was his management of your conduct review today, the timing, the method consistent with standard administrative procedure, or did it feel like something else?" Sarah was quiet for a moment. She looked at Torres. The surgical resident was on his phone now, speaking rapidly, and Nair was logging an order with the focus of someone working against a clock. "Felt like a man trying to remove me from the building before anyone with authority could hear what I'd been saying for 3 months, she said. Another pause. "Longer this time. Thank you, Nurse Donovan," Reese said. "You'll be hearing from my office. Probably Monday." He hung up. Sarah put her phone in her pocket and stepped back to Torres's bedside. And for the next 40 minutes, she was entirely present for the business of keeping him stable while the surgical team assembled, tracking his vitals, watching his breathing, answering his questions honestly when he had them, and not pretending she had answers when she didn't. The surgical team came in at 7:10. A senior surgeon named Dr. Vasquez, who moved with the compact efficiency of someone who had been doing emergency procedures for 20 years and had no patience for anything that wasn't directly useful. He reviewed the film for 90 seconds, examined Torres for 4 minutes, and told him what was happening in the direct, undecorated language that Sarah had always found more genuinely kind than softened euphemisms. Developed a post-surgical complication, a small hemothorax, blood accumulating in the pleural space on your right side. It was masked by the pneumonia presentation initially. We need to drain it. It's a procedure, not a full surgery. You'll be under sedation. The risk is low, and the risk of not doing it is significantly higher. Torres looked at Vasquez and then at Sarah, and what he said was, "You caught it." "Galloway caught the imaging," Sarah said. I just asked the right questions." "That's the same thing," Torres said. Vasquez was already moving, already calling for the procedure room, and Sarah stepped back and let the surgical team take the space they needed. And she stood in the corridor outside his room and felt the full weight of the day arrive in her legs all at once. She sat in the corridor on a chair pulled from the nurse's station for 11 minutes while they prepped Torres for the procedure. She didn't intend to sit for long. She sat because her body had made a unilateral decision, and she'd learned in 14 years not to argue with her body about things like that when it had a point. She thought about Reese's call, the office of the Inspector General. That was a different category of investigation than a facility review by Fenn's Medical Readiness Committee, broader authority, specific jurisdiction over mixed conduct, the kind of inquiry that didn't stay contained to a single facility. Thought about Holt and the boxes being cleared from his office, and she thought about the HR witness who had been standing in her ward 3 hours ago with a tablet, and she thought about the particular expression on Holt's face after that phone call, the one that had said he'd just understood the full shape of his situation. She was not satisfied by that exactly. Satisfaction implied she'd wanted this to happen, and she hadn't. She'd wanted to show up and do her job and go home. But she was not sorry either, and she was done pretending those were the same thing. Her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown local number. "This is Lois Kerrigan. I've been informed of the situation in IMC. Torres, do you need support up there?" Sarah typed back, "Surgical team is with him." Vasquez, "It's under control." A pause. "Then good. Come find me when you're clear. I'll be in the facility director's office until 9. Sarah put the phone away. Pauline appeared at the end of the corridor with a jacket, Sarah's own jacket, which she'd left at the nurse's station downstairs, and held it out without comment. "You're off the clock," Pauline said. "I know. The ward is fine. Aldridge is staying for the extra hours," she offered. Sarah took the jacket. "She's good. She's learning." Pauline looked at her with the particular directness of a person who has decided that something needs to be said. You should eat something before you talk to Kerrigan. I'll find something. There's a sandwich from the cart in the break room. I put it there an hour ago on the assumption that you hadn't eaten since noon. Sarah looked at her. Half sandwich, Pauline corrected, without any particular expression. I ate the other half. Sarah made a sound that was close to a laugh. Thank you, Pauline? Don't. I'm going to, anyway. Pauline made her sound the not quite law and went back toward the elevator. Torres came out of the procedure at 8:45. Sarah was in the corridor when they wheeled him back to his room, and she fell in alongside the gurney for the 30 seconds of transit because she'd promised she wasn't going anywhere, and she was not the kind of person who made that promise loosely. He was groggy from the sedation, eyes half open, processing the immediate environment with the slow-motion awareness of someone coming back from anesthesia. He looked at her. Hey, she said. Hey. His voice was thick. Did it work? Vasquez says it went clean. Your saturation came up to 96 while you were under. Closed his eyes, then opened them again. 96. That's a good number. Yeah. He was quiet for the length of the corridor. Then, you're still here. I said I wasn't going anywhere. Your shift ended, Torres. Okay. He looked at the ceiling rolling above him as they moved. Okay. They got him settled. His saturation on the monitor read 95. His heart rate was coming down from the procedural elevation, moving toward a range that Vasquez would be happy with. Galloway was checking his drain output. The room had the organized, purposeful energy of a clinical space doing what it was designed to do. Sarah stood at the foot of his bed for a moment. He was already most of the way back to sleep, the way people go after sedation, not gradual, but a cliff edge, consciousness running right up to it and then over. She waited until his breathing had settled into the regular rhythm of genuine rest. Then she left. Kerrigan's office, Holt's former office, technically, the nameplate already removed from the door, in what, like Sarah assumed, was the fastest administrative action Hartwell had seen in years, was lit from the N6 interior when Sarah arrived at 9:05. Kerrigan was at the desk with 2 open laptops and a phone she'd clearly been on recently. The motivational prints that had lined the walls under Holt's tenure were gone, leaving rectangular ghosts of slightly darker paint where they'd hung. Sarah noticed that. She didn't say anything about it. Down, Kerrigan said. Anne pointed at the chair across the desk, and Sarah sat. Torres's post-procedure, Sarah said. Hemothorax drain, Vasquez's team, saturation 95 and climbing. I know. Vasquez called me from the procedure room. Kerrigan looked at her directly. He told me you identified the complication from imaging before any of the IMC staff had flagged it. Galloway flagged the imaging. I recognized the pattern. From combat, Sarah said. Blast injury complications present differently than surgical complications, but the cascade has similarities. Galloway's red was accurate. He knew something was wrong. I knew what the wrong thing was. Kerrigan absorbed that. She had the quality Sarah had noticed in their first meeting. She listened in a way that was actually processing, rather than waiting for a turn to speak. I've been reviewing Holt's administrative files for the past 4 hours, Kerrigan said. With assistance from 2 members of the DoD review team who arrived on site at 6:30, she paused. I want to walk you through some of what we found, because it's directly relevant to your situation, and because you deserve to know what you were working inside. She turned one of the laptops to face Sarah. On the screen was a document internal, Hartwell letterhead, dated 8 months ago. Sarah scanned the first paragraph. It was a facilities assessment written by the HVAC contractor, describing the temperature regulation failure in the Northern Wing trauma corridor and specifying the repair cost and urgency. Contractor had rated it high priority. Holt had received it. There was a read receipt in the chain. He had not forwarded it to facilities management. He had not approved the repair budget. He had filed it and the filing notation in his own system, apparently described it as deferred pending quarterly review. 8 months ago. He knew, Sarah said. He knew. Kerrigan clicked to the next document. This is the staffing request from Pauline Okafor, submitted 14 months ago, requesting a review of overnight nursing ratios in post-surgical recovery. It was received, logged, and assigned to a subcommittee. She paused. The subcommittee had no members. It was a filing mechanism. Sarah looked at the screen. And this, Kerrigan said, and clicked again, is the medication reconciliation protocol that you flagged in week 4 of your employment. You submitted to concern through the staff feedback portal. Portal routes concerns to the director's office for triage. She looked at Sarah. It was marked resolved the day after you submitted it. There's no record of any review. The room was very quiet. Sarah had known, in the abstract way you know things from the pattern of how a system behaves, that her concerns had been going somewhere dark. She had not known how methodically dark that somewhere had been. There was a difference between a system that was dysfunctional and a system that had been specifically and deliberately managed to appear functional while producing none of the outcomes that functionality was supposed to generate. Holt hadn't just been incompetent. He'd been organized about it. How long has this been the pattern? Sarah said. Best estimate, based on what we've pulled tonight, 4 years. Kerrigan closed the laptop. Since he was promoted to director of operations, the facility's inspection record in that period is excellent. Perfect commendation scores. The gap between the inspection record and the operational reality is, she paused, choosing her word substantial. Sarah thought about the trophy case in the lobby, the additional spotlights, the laminated posters. He was managing the appearance of the facility, she said. Not the facility. Correctly. And today's inspection was supposed to confirm another clean score. Yes. Kerrigan looked at her. Your patch was the least of his problems with you. You were the most recent in a pattern of staff members who'd raised legitimate operational concerns and been managed out or into compliance. 2 nurses in the past 3 years. A respiratory tech. A junior physician who left for another facility and listed the environment as his reason in his exit interview. She paused. Nobody connected the pattern because nobody was looking for it. Until today, when Admiral Fenn's committee arrived expecting to conduct a routine inspection and instead found a nurse with a combat patch and a patient in respiratory distress, Sarah said. Among other things, Kerrigan's expression was not without something like dark humor. You were somewhat difficult to ignore. Sarah looked at the desk. The rectangular ghosts of the motivational prints. The nameplate that was no longer on the door. What happens to Holt? She said. The DoD review is formal as of this evening. The IG has jurisdiction given the military medical mandate of this facility. Colonel Reese's office has been in contact. Kerrigan folded her hands on the desk. In my personal assessment, and I've been watching Clifford Holt manage this facility from the position of Chief of Clinical Operations for 4 years, and I have my own significant frustrations about that experience. He will not return to any leadership position in a military medical context. The liability picture is too clear. Sarah let that settle. Conduct review he initiated against you, Kerrigan continued. I'm withdrawing it formally tonight. I'll have documentation to you before end of day tomorrow. Appreciate that. I also want to talk to you about your role here going forward. Kerrigan straightened. What I've seen today clinically, interpersonally, in terms of how you manage a ward and how you advocate for patients when the system is working against you is not something I want to lose from this facility. But I also want to be honest with you. The review process over the next several months is going to be significant. There will be days when this place is uncomfortable to be in. It's been uncomfortable to be in for 3.5 months, Sarah said. Fair. A beat. Are you planning to stay? Sarah thought about it. She thought about Torres's saturation, reading 95. She thought about Aldridge staying for extra hours. She thought about Pauline putting a sandwich in the break room on the assumption On the assumption that Sergio hadn't eaten since noon, which was the specific kind of practical care she'd learned to look for as an indicator of a team worth being part of. "I'm planning to come back on Monday," she said. Kerrigan nodded once, and there was something in the nod that wasn't exactly relief, but was close to it the specific expression of a person who has been hoping for a particular answer and received it. "One more thing," Kerrigan said. She opened the second laptop and turned it to face Sarah. It was an email chain. She gave Sarah a moment to read the visible portion. It was from Reese's office, the IG dated 2 hours ago, addressed to the Hartwell Executive Director's office and Kerrigan. It referenced the conduct review, the inspection findings, and the preliminary documentation of Holt's administrative record. The bottom of the visible section was a single sentence that Sarah read twice. "Per Admiral Fenn's recommendation, a formal commendation for patient advocacy and clinical excellence has been initiated for Nurse Sarah Donovan through the DoD Office of Military Medical Affairs, pending review." Sarah looked at the screen for a long moment. She thought about what Fenn had said in the consultation room. "I'm not to create an obligation. I'm not saying this to create an obligation." She thought about Reese's question on the phone, the careful, specific questions of a person assembling a record rather than just a narrative. She hadn't wanted any of this. She wanted to be clear about that in her own head, because it mattered to her to be honest about her own motivations. She hadn't kept the patch on her shoulder because she was building toward a commendation. She'd done it because taking it off would have meant agreeing that the only thing it was worth was what only thing it was worth Clifford Holt thought of it when he looked at it from a hallway. And Derek Ullman's photograph was in a frame somewhere in Pensacola, in the house of people who had given his things a permanent place. And whatever that was worth was worth more than Clifford Holt's opinion of her uniform. "You don't have to respond to it tonight," Kerrigan said. "I know." Sarah closed the laptop gently and pushed it back across the desk. "I'll deal with it Monday." She stood up. Kerrigan stood too, which again was the gesture Sarah hadn't expected and still didn't quite know what to do with. "Go home," Kerrigan said. "You've been here since before 6. "I have a dog," Sarah said, which was not really a response, but was the most honest version of yes she had available. She walked out of the office and down the administrative corridor, and she was halfway to the main exit when her phone buzzed one more time. A text. From an internal Hartwell number, she recognized this time the nurse's station in the IMC. She opened it. "Torres is awake and asking if you're still in the building." Galloway. She stopped walking. She stood in the administrative corridor of Hartwell Military Medical Center at 9:17 on a Friday night. The motivational print ghosts visible through the open office door behind her, and the lobby trophy case with its extra spotlights somewhere ahead of her. And she looked at her phone and felt something move through her that was not triumph and not relief, and wasn't quite any of the things she would have predicted feeling at the end of this particular day. Type back, "Tell him I'm on my way out. Tell him I'll be here Monday." The phone in her pocket. She was almost to the lobby when the main entrance doors opened from outside, and 2 men walked in suits, not uniforms, carrying the particular energy of people arriving with official purpose rather than visiting purpose. One of them had a document case that looked like Brask's but wasn't. The other was on a phone call that he ended as he stepped through the door. They stopped at the reception desk. Sarah was 10 feet away and moving toward the exit and would have walked past them without event, except that the man who'd ended his phone call looked up as she passed and looked at her name badge and then looked at her left shoulder patch and said, "Excuse me, Nurse Donovan?" Stopped. He held up a credentials case. She looked at it. Not DoD IG, different agency, different seal, one she recognized after a moment's processing from briefings she'd attended years ago in a completely different context. "I'm Special Agent Harmon, Defense Criminal Investigative Service," he said. "We've been asked to conduct a parallel inquiry into administrative practices at this facility." He paused. "We have some questions about Director Holt's management record." But we've also been given some information about a financial matter that's adjacent to the operational review. And your name came up in that context. Sarah looked at him. My name, she said. Specifically, a payment made through the facility's discretionary budget to a private consulting firm. Harmon said approximately 11 months ago. The firm was contracted to conduct a staff performance review. The review produced a recommendation to, he checked his notes, restructure the Northern Wing nursing team. He looked at her. You were hired 3 months after that restructuring. Sarah said nothing. The consulting firm, Harmon continued, has been identified as a shell entity with no verifiable operations. The principal listed on its registration documents is not a licensed consultant. He paused, and the pause had weight. Principal is Holt's brother-in-law. The lobby was quiet. Sarah absorbed that information the way she'd absorbed difficult information all day completely, without flinching, letting it land and settle into the full picture of what it meant. Not just incompetence, not just the management of appearances over outcomes. He'd been paying for it, literally, with the facility's budget, routing money through a fraudulent contractor to manufacture the justification for restructuring a team that had apparently been raising concerns he didn't want raised, and then hiring into that restructured team with the same careful calculation. She thought about the 2 nurses Kerrigan had mentioned, the respiratory tech, the physician who'd listed the environment as his reason for leaving. She thought about what Kerrigan had said. Nobody connected the pattern because nobody was looking for it. Until today, he restructured the team to get rid of the people who were talking, she said. Harmon looked at her steadily. That's one interpretation of the available evidence. And he hired me to fill a slot that he assumed would be easier to manage. Also consistent with the record, yes. Sarah looked at the lobby, trophy case and its new lights, at the framed photographs of smiling officials, at the entrance of a military medical facility that existed, in theory, for the specific purpose of caring for people who had broken themselves in service to a country that was supposed to have their backs. What do you need from me? She said. A formal interview, Harmon said. Monday morning, if that works. My colleague will give you the details. He paused. I know it's been a long day. It has, she said. One last thing. He looked at her shoulder, at the patch. Colonel Reese's office sent over some background on you before we arrived. Salerno, 2014. She waited. I was stationed at Bagram that rotation, he said. Different unit. But I heard about that evacuation corridor. He looked at her for a moment in a way that was not formal and not part of the interview. Just a person looking at another person who had been in a place they both remembered as significant. I just wanted to say that. Sarah held his gaze for a moment. Okay, she said, and it held more weight than the word usually did. She pushed through the main doors into the Calverton night, cold and clear. The parking lot half empty, the mountain line visible as a dark edge against the sky. Car. She sat in it for 90 seconds before she started the engine, not thinking about anything specific, just letting the day move through her and settle. Then she started the engine and drove home. Her dog met her at the door with the complete and immediate enthusiasm of an animal for whom the length of her absence was irrelevant to the quality of the reunion. And she sat on the floor of her own hallway and let that happen for a full minute, which she needed more than she would have admitted to anyone. She fed him. She stood at the kitchen counter and ate the actual dinner she'd been intending to have since 7, which was leftover rice and vegetables that were slightly past their best and completely adequate. She drank a glass of water. She looked at the patch, which was still on her jacket, hung by the door. Her phone buzzed. This time it was her sister Sunday's call, coming 2 days early. I saw something online, her sister said, without preamble. Something about a military hospital in Boise. Are you okay? I'm fine, Sarah said. That's your I'm fine. That means something happened. Something happened, Sarah said. I'm fine. A pause. Do you want to talk about it? Sarah looked at the patch by the door. Not tonight, she said, but there's something you should know. She paused, and for the first time all day, something loosened in her chest that she hadn't realized she'd been holding. They tried to take the patch, and they couldn't, she said. Her sister was quiet for a moment. Good, she said. Sarah stood at her kitchen counter in the dark for a moment after they hung up, and she thought about Monday, the formal interview, the IG process, the operational review that Kerrigan had said was going to last 3 months and be uncomfortable. She thought about 14 beds in the northern wing and a team that had been working inside a broken system for longer than she'd been there and had kept the patients alive anyway. Through sheer professional stubbornness and the refusal to let the system's failures become their patients' failures. She thought about Torres's saturation, reading 95. And then she thought about something that hadn't fully resolved itself until right now, the reason the DCS agent's last piece of information mattered in a way that was separate from the legal and institutional picture it completed. Holt hadn't restructured the team and hired her by accident. He'd brought her in because he'd looked at her record and seen a single combat medic with no institutional connections, no internal allies. No reason anyone would listen to her if she started raising concerns someone who could fill a staffing slot without becoming a problem. He had looked at her file and seen someone he could manage. He had been wrong about that in a way that had cost him everything he'd spent 4 years building. And the specific quiet thing, was that he'd been wrong, not because Sarah had said it would have to be a problem, or had arrived with any intention other than showing up and doing her job. He'd been wrong because he'd read her record and seen the rank and the years and the postings, and he'd made the same mistake everyone made when they looked at a woman in a nurse's uniform with a faded combat patch on her shoulder. He'd seen what she'd done. He hadn't understood what she was. Monday morning came gray and cold, the kind of Calverton October that arrived without apology and planned to stay. Sarah was in the parking lot at 5:58, 2 minutes before she intended to be, which meant she'd been driving slightly faster than necessary, which meant something in her was ready for whatever the day was going to deliver. She sat in her car for those 2 minutes and looked at the entrance of Hartwell Military Medical Center. Put on her jacket. She pinned the patch to her left shoulder. She got out of the car. The lobby was different. At 6 in the morning, quieter. The clinical staff beginning their shift rotations. The administrative hallways not yet populated. She passed through the main entrance and past the trophy case, and at the nurses' station of the northern wing, she found Pauline already there, coat still on, reviewing the weekend handoff notes with the focused efficiency of someone who had not spent the weekend worrying about whether the institution was going to be there on Monday because she had too much actual work to do to indulge that. Pauline looked up. She looked at the patch. She looked at Sarah. She said nothing, which was exactly the right thing to say, and went back to her handoff notes. Sarah hung up her coat, sat down at her workstation, and pulled up her patient charts. 14 beds, 6 nursing staff, a facility under review. A ward that had been functioning despite its management for years, and was now, for the first time, possibly going to get the conditions it needed to function because of it. She opened Torres's chart. His overnight report was clean saturation 96, fever continuing to resolve, drain output within expected parameters. Vasquez had noted in his evening update that the hemothoracic presentation was consistent with a missed finding on initial post-op imaging and had flagged the imaging protocol for review. She read that notation twice. Then she read Aldridge's overnight nursing note, which was precise, detailed, and structured in exactly the format Sarah had shown her during one of their first week orientations, when Aldridge had been struggling with clinical documentation. Aldridge had been practicing. Sarah could see it in the sentence structure. She sat back in her chair. Down the corridor, the day shift was beginning its first quiet movements, medication carts, vital sign checks, the low-frequency hum of a ward starting its day. Somewhere in the administrative wing, Harmon and his DCIS colleague were set up for the morning's formal interviews. Somewhere else, the DoD review team was running through the facility assessment. Kerrigan was presumably already in her office, with 2 open laptops and a phone she'd been on since before 6. And Holt was wherever people go when the system they built to protect themselves becomes the evidence against them. Sarah pulled up her first patient's chart for the morning. She had just started reading when her workstation pinged with an internal message from Kerrigan. One development before you start your shift. Holt's assistant came in this morning to collect personal items from his office. She brought with her a document she said she'd been holding since Thursday, she said, and I'm quoting directly, that she didn't know who else to give it to. Sarah read the next line and then she read it again. Because the document, the one the assistant had been holding since Thursday, the one she hadn't known who to give, was a written complaint. Submitted by 3 members of Hartwell's administrative staff, dated 6 weeks ago, against Clifford Holt, citing financial irregularities, staff misconduct, and the systematic suppression of clinical safety concerns. It had never been filed because the only person it could have been filed with under Hartwell's internal structure was Holt himself. Sarah read Kerrigan's message a 3rd time, not because she didn't understand it. She understood it completely on the first pass. She read it a 3rd time because there was something in the specific shape of it, a complaint, written, dated 6 weeks ago, held by an assistant who hadn't known where else to take it, that required a moment to fully absorb as a fact rather than a possibility. 3 members of Holt's own administrative staff had seen enough to put it in writing 6 weeks ago, and they had been as trapped as everyone else, because the only place the complaint could go was to the man it was about. She typed back to Kerrigan, I'll come to you after my first patient round. 20 minutes. Then she set her phone down and started her rounds, because 14 patients had woken up to a Monday morning and needed a nurse who was present, and she was not going to shortchange them because the administrative situation was interesting. She moved through the ward with the systematic focus she brought to every morning, checking vitals, reviewing overnight notes, talking to the patients who were awake and wanted to talk, adjusting the care plan for the room 3 patient, whose adhesive reaction had evolved over the week into something that needed a dermatology consult. She was thorough, and she was unhurried, and she was aware, somewhere in the background of her attention, that this was the first Monday morning in 3.5 months that she'd walked this ward without the specific low-frequency tension of waiting for the next administrative interference. It was not a comfortable absence, exactly. It was more like the way silence sounds strange after sustained noise. She was still listening for something that wasn't there anymore. She finished her round in 18 minutes, which was a personal record for a 14-bed ward, though she'd sacrifice no quality for it. She gave Pauline a clean handoff on 2 patients who needed closer monitoring during the morning, put on her coat, and walked to the administrative wing. Kerrigan had the complaint document on her desk when Sarah arrived. A printed copy, 4 pages, single-spaced, with a cover sheet that had 3 signatures and a date. Kerrigan pushed it across the desk, and Sarah picked it up and read it standing. Careful, specific, dated entries going back 14 months, describing financial transactions, staff decisions, the systematic pattern of complaints being received and disappeared, the consulting firm payment, and 3 specific incidents where Holt had directly instructed administrative staff to alter documentation before it was filed. The language was not legal language. These were not lawyers, just people who had worked inside something wrong for long enough that they'd decided to write it down, even knowing there was nowhere to send it. 3rd signature was Holt's own assistant. She'd been there the whole time. She'd signed her name to a document that accused her own employer of fraud and misconduct, and then she'd held it for 6 weeks because there was nowhere safe to take it and she'd brought it in this morning because Holt wasn't coming back, and she didn't want it to disappear with his office. Sarah set the document down. She held it for 6 weeks, Sarah said. Yes. Because the structure didn't give her anywhere else to go. Yes. Kerrigan looked at the document. She came in at 5:30 this morning. Before most of the review team arrived, she told me she'd been carrying it in her bag since the Thursday before you started. Sarah did the math, the Thursday before she started, which meant that while Holt was preparing to hire her as a manageable addition to a restructured team, his own assistant was sitting with a 4-page complaint document in her bag and no mechanism for delivering it. Is she okay? Sarah said. Kerrigan looked at her. The question seemed to land slightly unexpectedly. She's shaken. I've asked HR to sit with her this morning. Good. Sarah straightened. What happens to the complaint now? Goes to Reese's office as supplementary documentation. Combined with the financial records from Friday night, it completes the picture. Kerrigan paused. The DCIS has enough to move forward with a formal investigation. Reese called me at 7 this morning. He indicated the IG report will include a recommendation for criminal referral. Criminal referral, not just administrative removal. The specific language that meant Holt's situation had moved out of the category of professional consequence and into something with a different kind of permanence. That's appropriate, Sarah said. Yes, Kerrigan said. It is. They looked at each other across the desk, and there was something in the exchange that didn't need elaboration. 2 women who had been working inside a system that had been specifically managed to minimize their effectiveness, and who were now sitting in the room where that management had been run, having a conversation about its ending. One more thing, Kerrigan said. She picked up her phone and turned the screen towards Sarah. An email from Admiral Fenn's office, sent Sunday evening at 6:42 p.m. Addressed to the Hartwell Executive Director, Kerrigan, and Reese. Sarah scanned it. It was 3 paragraphs, brief, clear, the formal language of official correspondence, carrying something that felt, underneath the formal language, like a decision that had been made with some care. 3rd paragraph specified that the DEN EEDD commendation for patient advocacy and clinical excellence, recommended for Nurse Sarah Donovan, had been approved at the flag officer level and would be formally presented at a ceremony to be scheduled at the facility within 30 days. Approved at the flag officer level meant Fenn had signed it himself. Sarah looked at the email for a moment. She thought about what she'd told Kerrigan on Friday, that she hadn't kept the patch on her shoulder because she was building toward anything. That was still true. It was true in the specific way that things you do for the right reason in the moment don't become less right because they subsequently lead somewhere you didn't anticipate. I'd like to request something about the ceremony, Sarah said. Kerrigan raised an eyebrow. If there's going to be something formal, I want it on the ward. Not in a conference room, not in the lobby. On the ward. She paused. With the whole nursing team present. Not just me. Kerrigan looked at her for a moment. I'll relay that. Pauline Okafor has been running that ward correctly for 15 years. Inside a system that worked against her, Sarah said. Aldridge is 24, and she froze for 8 seconds last Friday morning, and then she did every subsequent thing right. If there's going to be any kind of acknowledgement, those are the people who should be in the room. Kerrigan wrote something on her notepad. She wrote it slowly, which was her way of indicating she was taking it seriously. I'll relay it, she said again, and this time it sounded like a commitment. Formal DCIS interviews began at 9. Sarah was the 3rd person called. She sat across a table from Harmon and a second agent named Torres, no relation. Different Torres. She'd confirmed in the small conference room, where Fenn had spent his Friday afternoon on the phone, and she answered their questions the same way she'd answered every question since Friday morning. Chronologically, specifically, without editorializing, and without leaving anything out. The interview lasted 40 minutes. At the end, Harmon closed his notebook and looked at her with the expression of someone who has gathered what they needed and is making a final assessment. "There's one thing I want to ask that's not strictly related to the investigation," he said. "You can decline to answer." She waited. "Holt pulled your personnel file before he completed the hire," Harmon said. "We found a note in his administrative records from that period. He'd flagged you as low institutional risk. His assessment was that a medic transitioning out of combat support into civilian nursing would be the word he used, was compliant." He paused. "Did you know he'd assessed you that way?" Sarah thought about the parking lot on her first day. About the way Holt had looked at her in the corridor. The first time, the calculating look of a man who has already made a decision and is just confirming his math. "Expected something like that," she said. "Does it bother you?" She considered the question honestly. "It bothers me that he built a system where that kind of calculation made sense. It bothers me that it worked until it didn't." She paused. "It doesn't bother me that he was wrong about me." Harmon looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded, once, and closed his folder, and that was the end of the interview. Torres came down to the northern ward on Wednesday. He was ambulatory by then, slowly, with a cane he was using under protest, his right side still tender from the drain and the healing around it. He'd been cleared for limited mobility by Vasquez, who had added to his notes that the patient was going to walk, regardless of whether he was cleared, and that supervised walking was therefore preferable to the alternative. Sarah had read that note and recognized the logic. He appeared at the nurse's station at 10:15 with the particular expression of a man who has been in a hospital bed for 5 days and has strong feelings about that. "I wanted to come down before..." He stopped, recalibrated. "I wanted to see the ward." Sarah looked at him. His color was better. His breathing was even. The walk from the elevator had caused him something. She could see it in the careful way he was distributing his weight, but it hadn't cost him too much. "How are the stairs treating you?" she said. "I took the elevator," he said, with the tone of a man making a significant admission. "Good call." He looked around the ward, the nurse's station, the patient corridor, the supply room through its open door. The HVAC that had been repaired on Saturday, 2 maintenance workers who'd arrived with parts and apology and had the repair done in 4 hours. The temperature in the corridor finally sitting where it should have been sitting for 8 months. "This is where you work," he said. "Every day." He looked at her. Admiral Fenn, the investigation. He paused. "Does it feel like it was worth it? The whole fight?" Sarah thought about that. It was a real question, and it deserved a real answer. "I didn't start a fight," she said. "I kept a patch on my shoulder, and I did my job. The fight was already there. I just stopped stepping around it." He absorbed that. "The patch thing. I didn't understand it at first. When you told me you wouldn't take it off. Most people don't. I do now." He looked at her left shoulder. "It's not about the patch, is it? It's about what happens to a person when they agree to be smaller than they are, because someone with authority tells them to." Sarah looked at him. 23 years old, 5 days out from emergency surgery, standing in the northern ward of a military medical facility on a Wednesday morning, and he just said the thing more precisely than she'd been able to say it to herself. "Yeah," she said. "That's about right." He nodded slowly. He looked at the ward one more time, the organized, functional, alive activity of a nursing team doing its work. And then he said, "I'm going back upstairs before Vasquez finds out I came down here and kills me." "Vasquez already knows," Sarah said. He cleared it. "He said you'd be impossible otherwise." Torres made a sound that was fully a laugh this time, no cough attached to it, and Sarah felt something loosen in her chest that had been carefully held since the morning she'd walked into his room and found his saturation reading 81. She watched him make his way back to the elevator. Slow, careful, moving like a person who had recently been through something significant and was taking it seriously without being defeated by it. The elevator doors closed. She went back to work. The ceremony happened on a Thursday, 3 weeks after the Friday that had changed everything about Hartwell Military Medical Center. They held it on the ward, per Sarah's request, which Kerrigan had relayed, and Fenn's office had agreed to without apparent difficulty. The Northern Wing post-surgical recovery ward had 14 beds and a nurse's station and a supply room and a repaired HVAC system that kept the corridor at the correct temperature. And on a Thursday morning in the third week of October, it also had Admiral Douglas Fenn standing at one end of the nurse's station with a formal commendation document and a small assembly of people who had been specifically invited because they belonged there. Pauline was there, Aldridge was there, she'd come in on her day off, which Sarah had not asked her to do, and which meant something specific. Webb was there, standing slightly apart from the group with the expression of a man who is attending something he feels complicated about and has decided to feel complicated about it honestly, rather than pretend otherwise. Galloway from the respiratory team. Vasquez, who had arrived 5 minutes late and had not apologized. Dr. Nair, who had sent Sarah a brief, direct email earlier in the week, saying simply that she'd reviewed the case timeline and that Sarah's clinical judgment on the imaging had been the thing that had mattered and that she understood that now. Kerrigan was there, 2 members of the DCIS team. Reese's office had sent a representative, a major named Alvarez, who had arrived with a separate commendation document from the IG's office related to Sarah's formal cooperation with the investigation and the evidentiary record she'd maintained through 3.5 months of documented concerns. There was no press. Sarah had asked Kerrigan about that specifically, and Kerrigan had said there would be no press, and there hadn't been. The ceremony itself was not long. Fenn was not a man who confused the weight of a moment with the length of the words used to describe it. He read the commendation citation patient advocacy in conditions of institutional resistance, clinical judgment directly responsible for the preservation of a service member's life, integrity under administrative pressure. And then he said, without ceremony, that the commendation was the minimum the institution owed her, and that what the institution actually owed her was a facility that deserved the quality of work she'd brought to it. Then he looked at her. The commendation is formal recognition, he said. What I want to say personally is separate from that. He paused. 4 years ago, a review board read a report about a medic who went back into a corridor 4 times when she was supposed to stay put. We discussed it, we wrote it up, and then we let it disappear into process, because process was easier than doing the harder thing. He held her gaze. This is the harder thing, and it's late, and I'm sorry about that. The ward was very quiet. Sarah held his gaze for a moment. She thought about Derek Ullman, as she sometimes did when the corridor of a medical facility went very still. She thought about his photograph and about the 40 minutes, and about the cold. You're here now, she said. Fenn nodded. He pinned the commendation to her jacket above the patch and stepped back. There was no applause. Saisa had asked Kerrigan to ask for none, because applause felt wrong for a room that contained people who'd been working inside a broken system for years and deserved acknowledgement of their own. Instead, there was something quieter and more honest, the particular quality of a room full of people who have all been through something difficult together and are standing on the other side of it, taking stock. Pauline put her hand briefly on Sarah's arm. That was it. That was everything. The investigation moved in the methodical, unhurried way that formal investigations move when they have sufficient evidence and no political incentive to slow down. The DCIS filed its preliminary findings within 2 weeks of the Friday inspection. The financial irregularities, the consulting firm, the payments, the 14 months of diverted budget were documented in sufficient detail to support a criminal referral. Reese's IG report cited 17 specific instances of administrative misconduct, including the systematic suppression of safety complaints, the manipulation of inspection documentation, and the conduct review initiated against Sarah as an act of retaliatory interference with patient safety advocacy. Clifford Holt was formally charged under the relevant federal statutes on a Tuesday morning, 6 weeks after the day he'd stood in the northern wing corridor and told Sarah she had 20 minutes to remove her patch or vacate the ward. Charging documents were public record. Sarah read them once and did not read them again. The 3 administrative staff members who had written the complaint, 6 weeks before anyone could receive it, received formal recognition from Kerrigan's office for their documentation. Holt's assistant, whose name was Renata Solis, and who had worked at Hartwell for 11 years, was offered a new position in Kerrigan's direct operational team. Doing the work she'd always been doing, but for someone who understood what she was actually worth. Accepted. The HVAC in the trauma corridor was fully operational. The staffing review resulted in 2 additional nursing positions approved for the northern wing, which did not solve the problem entirely, but moved it from critical to manageable, which was the difference between a system that was breaking its people and one that was at least trying not to. The medication reconciliation protocol that Sarah had flagged in week 4 was overhauled by a joint nursing and pharmacy committee that Webb had volunteered to co-chair, apparently having decided that the correct response to the previous 2 months was to become the kind of physician the facility needed rather than the kind the facility had been producing. Sarah had not suggested any of this to him. She was glad he'd arrived at it on his own. Torres was discharged on a Saturday 22 days after he'd arrived as a routine post-surgical patient, and 19 days after his oxygen saturation had read 81 on a Friday morning, while Sarah had her hand on his wrist, and the inspection party stood in the corridor outside his door. Vasquez cleared him with a set of instructions that Torres absorbed with the patient but impatient energy of someone who is already planning to exceed the recommended activity levels as soon as he's out of the parking lot. Sarah was on shift when he left. He stopped at the nurse's station. He had his bag over one shoulder carefully on the left side, keeping weight off the right, and he was in civilian clothes for the first time since she'd known him, which made him look simultaneously younger and more like himself in the specific way that happens when people are no longer defined by their medical context. 96, he said, when he reached her. She looked at him. Morning, he said. 96. I asked Galloway to check before I came down, because I wanted to know the actual number when I walked out. Sarah felt something move across her face that wasn't quite a smile, but was in that vicinity. That's a good number. Yeah. He looked at the ward. The repaired ceiling panel near room 7, where the maintenance team had replaced a section of damaged tile. The nurse's station, with its organized, functional activity. Patch on Sarah's shoulder, with the commendation pinned above it. I wrote a letter, he said, to the review committee, about what happened that morning, about you catching it. I wanted them to have it in the record. She hadn't known about the letter. Something tightened briefly in her throat. You didn't have to do that, she said. I know. He looked at her. Thank you for paying attention when it would have been easier not to. She held his gaze. That's the job, she said. I know that too. He paused. But I think you know there's a difference between people who do it because it's the job and people who do it because they can't imagine doing it any other way. She didn't have an answer for that because he was right and there wasn't much to add. He shifted his bag, said goodbye to Pauline, who gave him a curt nod that was her version of significant warmth, and walked out to the elevator, and Sarah watched him go until the doors closed. November came, and the mountains around Calverton went white at the peaks, and the northern ward ran its routine with the quality of a system that was still not perfect. No ward ever was, but was now imperfect in the ordinary. Workable ways rather than the specifically managed, harmful ways it had been before. Aldridge had a difficult shift in her 6th week, a patient in respiratory distress at 3 in the morning who needed rapid intervention and was 3 rooms from where Aldridge was stationed. She got there in time. She did not freeze. She ran her assessment and paged the on-call physician and had the situation stabilized before Sarah arrived to support, because Sarah had started doing overnight check-ins on the weeks when she was worried about the team's pressure levels, which was not technically her job description and which she would have done regardless. Afterward, at 4 in the morning in the break room, Aldridge sat with her coffee and said, "I thought about room 7. "Goods," Sarah said. "I was scared. I know. But I thought if she could go back 4 times into a corridor that was being shelled, I can walk 30 feet down a hospital hallway." She looked at her coffee. "Is that okay? That I used it that way?" Sarah thought about whether it was okay for someone to use the things she'd been through as a reference point for their own courage. She thought about Fenn saying the report had documented a young medic who kept going back and about what it felt like to have a thing you'd done in darkness, because there was no other choice, become a thing that lit something in another person. "Yeah," she said. "That's okay." Aldridge nodded. She drank her coffee. The break room was quiet in the 4 a.m. way. "Did it work?" Sarah asked. Thinking about it, Aldridge looked at her. "I was still scared." "Of course. But I went anyway. That's all it ever is," Sarah said. "You don't stop being scared. You just decide the patient matters more than the fear." Aldridge sat with that. Sarah watched her sit with it, not trying to resolve it into something simpler, just holding it as the complicated, true thing it was. That was the sign, Sarah had learned, of someone who was going to be good at this. Not the absence of doubt, but the willingness to carry it without letting it win. She left Aldridge in the break room and went back to her rounds. On a Friday morning, 6 weeks after the Friday that had started all of it, Sarah walked into Hartwell Military Medical Center at 6 a.m., past the trophy case, which Kerrigan had restructured to include a section on clinical excellence alongside the inspection commendations, and went to the nurses' station of the Northern Wing. She sat down. She pulled up her patient charts. She started her morning the way she started every morning, which was by learning exactly what the night had produced and what the day required. The patch was on her shoulder. It had not left her shoulder. The bloodstain was still there, darker than rust now, part of the fabric, as permanent as anything that has been held long enough becomes. She thought about Derek Ullman sometimes, on the mornings when the ward was quiet enough to think. She thought about his dog and his photograph, and the 40 minutes and the cold. She thought about him when she watched Aldridge handle a difficult case with the kind of calm that gets built through exactly the experiences that look like failure while they're happening. She thought about him when Torres's letter arrived in her personnel file, formally entered into the record, 3 paragraphs, clean and specific, the language of a young soldier who had understood exactly what had happened in room 7 and had decided it should be documented. The ward came to life around her, as it always did the morning routine of a facility, finding its frequency, the nurses coming in for their shifts, the patients beginning to wake to another day of the slow work of recovery. Pauline arrived with her coat still on and went straight to the handoff notes without speaking, which was exactly what Pauline did and was exactly what Sarah had come to rely on as a fixed point. She was an hour into her morning when Kerrigan's email came through. The DOD review had concluded. The full report was 73 pages. Sarah had not read all of it and was not going to read all of it, but Kerrigan had highlighted the sections relevant to the Northern Ward, and Sarah read those. Staffing changes were formalized. The protocol revisions were adopted. The maintenance accountability structure had been completely overhauled. The inspection commendation program, the one that had produced 18 months of perfect scores while patient risk, was under review by a committee whose mandate specifically included the gap between documented performance and operational reality. The report cited the Friday inspection as the triggering event. It cited, specifically, the refusal of a nursing staff member to comply with an administrative directive to remove a combat insignia from her uniform, and the subsequent patient emergency that had occurred in the presence of the inspection delegation as the specific sequence that had made the operational medical reality of Hartwell Military Medical Center visible in a way that could not be managed away. Sarah read that paragraph once. She thought about Holt standing in the corridor with the expression of a man who had already decided she was a problem he could solve. And she thought about the 15 seconds between the patch hitting the floor in the version of this story that hadn't happened, the version where she'd complied, removed it, stepped into administrative holding, and let someone from second shift cover her ward and Torres's call light, coming on at 8:55 in the version that had. 15 seconds, one decision, everything else downstream. She had not started anything. She had just refused to disappear. There was something in that worth sitting with, not as pride exactly, because pride in a specific act was a narrower thing than what she actually felt. It was more like understanding. The understanding that the systems that harm people most officially are the ones that train the people inside them to believe that disappearing is the only reasonable option. That the patch, the complaint in Renata Solis's bag, Pauline's 14 years of doing the right thing inside a structure that ignored it, all of it had been there, waiting for something to hold its ground long enough for the rest of it to find a place to land. She had held her ground, not perfectly, not without fear, not without the particular exhaustion of 3.5 months of being managed and assessed and maneuvered, not without the weight of everything the patch carried, which was real weight and had been real weight for years. But she had held it, and the ward was warm, and Torres's lungs were clear. And Aldridge was walking down hallways at 4 a.m. because she'd decided the patient mattered more than the fear. And somewhere in Pensacola, there was a photograph of a dog in a frame in a house where she had given everything a permanent place. And Sarah Donovan carried the weight of that photograph every day of her life and had decided a long time ago that the way to honor it was not to stop, but to keep going, to walk into the next room, assess the next patient, catch the next thing that someone else might have missed, and keep doing it until the day she couldn't. She pulled up her next chart. The ward ran around her, alive and imperfect and working. Stayed exactly where she was. There are institutions that are built to protect people, and there are institutions that are built to protect the appearance of protecting people. And the difference between them is not visible in the trophy cases, or the commendation scores, or the carefully lit lobbies. The difference is in the hallways, in the night shifts, in the staff members who keep raising their hands, even when the system has made it very clear that raised hands are inconvenient. The difference is in the people who decide, in the specific moment when it would cost them nothing to be quiet, that they are not willing to be smaller than what they know. Some of them come carrying patches that most people only see as insignia. What they are actually carrying is the evidence of every time the choice was hard, and they made it anyway, and that weight, worn honestly, has a way of being exactly the thing a broken room needs to finally find its balance.